and hatred. Is that what you've done with your free will, boy?
I remember you from yesterday.
I had a feeling that I should have taken care of you right then. The art of swordsmanship is learning how to kill. That is the truth.
I'm destined to destroy you.
That's impossible! How could this be happening?
Mentally, he's impossible to beat. He thinks of every conceivable advantage. I've never seen a power quite like his before. It's radical. The world doesn't work that way. There are times when you have to agree with people, even when you think they're wrong. Or do something, even though you think it's crazy.
What a load of horse piss.
What's that?
Hey, you can make all the excuses you want, but you're the one who decided how to live your life.
Logic is an enemy and truth is a menace.
What is good, y'all? It has been a long time since we have done a podcast, but I am here today with a special guest and a very special episode. We're going to be discussing the history of JRPGs, talking about some of our favorite JRPGs from each decade since the 80s. So, it's been a long time since I've done an episode, and I apologize. Just been very busy with live streams. You can go and check those live streams out at twitch.tv/bucknasty. I drop some of them on the YouTube, so feel free to slide on over there. And we will have a video version of this podcast available on the YouTube as well. But it will be in our usual places on Spotify, Apple Music, and anywhere podcasts may be found. But without further ado, let's get right into this topic. I'd like to introduce my my guest this week, the esteemed JRPG historian, Mr. Antoni.
Hey, thanks for having me. So, I guess just to give a quick introduction, I'm an academic. I got a PhD in cinema studies from NYU. And so that's how I mainly approached games, was through media. And so recently I've been researching the history of Japanese role-playing games and getting really into it. And I guess this is some lore for your viewers, but you and I had met through a mutual friend. And then one thing led to another, and we were nerding out over Japanese role-playing games for like the next 3 hours. So then you invited me here, and I'm really excited to talk about some things that we had already mentioned before.
Yeah, we had met a couple weeks ago at a friend's wedding, and I don't remember how the conversation exactly came up, but somebody mentioned like video games or some anime or something in relation to like Japan, and then JRPGs came up, and then for the next like 4 hours we just kind of took over the entire room, and we're just talking about JRPGs for an exhaustive amount of time from all different eras and decades and different types of developers and shit like that. So it was definitely a very interesting conversation. And I'm somebody that kind of grew up playing JRPGs my entire life. Like that was one of my first genres as a kid that I experienced. I remember one of my earliest memories was playing the SNES, and the first game that I feel like I ever played was Yoshi's Island, which is a little crazy. But the SNES was my first console, and I remember, I think my brother had Final Fantasy II, which was Final Fantasy IV in Japan. And that was one of my first kind of experiences with the JRPG genre, and also Super Mario RPG, which is also one of my favorite games of all time. And so the JRPG genre has been running in my blood since like the mid 90s. So it's been a very, very long time.
Yeah, and I think for our generation, it's all quite similar, right? People who grew up on the Super Nintendo and the PlayStation 1. So in my case, it was playing Final Fantasy 7, but around this time, emulators were readily available. So we
Oh
did
yeah.
have a Super Nintendo growing up, but we didn't have JRPGs on them. But then through emulation, I got to play a whole bunch of stuff I had never encountered before, including Super Mario RPG.
Yeah, Super Mario RPG is one of my personal favorites, man. Like I grew up on Mario games too, so like I said, like Yoshi's Island
Yeah.
was my first game. I played all the fucking Mario games. I had an NES too, so I played like all Mario Bros 1 through 3. And when because my brother just had like a whole fucking slew of games. And I remember when I found Super Mario RPG, I was like, what the fuck is this? Like as a kid, I remember thinking like, what
Yeah.
is this game? And I put it in the fucking in the SNES, you know, you blew in the cartridge like you always did. Then you put it in the SNES, it loads up, and I still remember the Squaresoft logo has like that weird. It has like a weird like green effect. It like phases in and out in that game, in the intro screen.
Hmm.
And I was like, wait a minute, what is this? And I had played I think Final Fantasy 4 first. Um, so I was kind of like familiar with JRPGs already. And then when I kind of got into like the actual like meat of the game and got into the first fight, I was like, "Oh shit, this is like that Final Fantasy game."
Yeah.
And I just remember being like blown away as a kid, man. Like that's one of my all-time fucking favorite games in all genres. And I don't
Hmm.
know if it's something that's attached like specifically to just like nostalgia, because nostalgia has a very strong effect, I think, on people. And that's like a completely separate conversation that I feel like I could talk about for a while.
Well, I do think it's somewhat related here because Square Enix is willing to invest millions of dollars into a trilogy for Final Fantasy VII, right? All
Yeah.
banking on nostalgia. And I think one of the questions I would have for viewers of the show would be you're mentioning, well, I grew up on this game, right? I think a big elephant in the room for today's topic is going to be Final Fantasy.
Oh yeah.
So imagine you were born in the year 2000, 2003. And by the time you're sort of coming of age, by the time you're a teenager, what are the big Final Fantasy titles, right? It's going to be Final Fantasy 14, which
Yeah.
had a really awful launch when it first came out, right? Final Fantasy 13, which is somewhat lukewarm, although I think I'm one of the game's few defenders, and then 15 and 16. And so I think this newer generation of players, because of the context they've grown up in, they don't have the same cultural attachment to some of these titles that we did.
Yeah, yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think like you said, it's kind of very nostalgia driven. It's like what you grew up playing. And I feel like there's a stark like split and contrast in the Final Fantasy kind of community, where you have a lot of the older fans that are just like still like craving the traditional like turn-based, like maybe like ATB system, just turn-based combat. And then you have like the newer generation that's more like action oriented, that loves like Final Fantasy 16, loves the combat. Basically any game from like Final Fantasy 13 and on, maybe even 12 you could sprinkle in there. They're fans of like the modern, like post Squaresoft generation of um Square Enix, and a lot of the older people are among the Squaresoft crowd. So like I feel like that's one of the only franchises where there's a stark contrast like that exists.
Yeah.
It's a very polarizing thing to see, especially like on the internet. You see people talking about JRPGs or on forums or in videos, and it's so divisive. Like just the idea of turn-based combat, and especially in like the newer games. Like I fucking hate Final Fantasy 16 because of the combat, and I'm a fan of like that
Hmm.
type of combat. Like I like the Devil May Cry games. I love like those action um like Kingdom Heartsy type of combat systems in
Right, right.
JRPGs. But for some reason, when it comes to Final Fantasy, and I think it's kind of like what you said, maybe it has to do with nostalgia, but I think there's something deeper at hand, and I think it has to do with like storytelling, exposition. I also kind of feel, because the more I'm talking about this, I kind of feel like we're we're gonna get into a very deep conversation about like Final Fantasy, and it's I feel like we could dedicate an entire episode to that and like kind of like the fall of Final Fantasy. Um, so I'll try and keep it short in terms of Final Fantasy, in case that's something that kind of comes up later, or something that maybe the people watching this want to see. They could let me know in the comments. Um, but let's get into, I guess, the topic that we were gonna actually discuss, which is the best, I guess, JRPGs of each decade. Um, and we'll, I guess, start with the 80s. So I'm curious to know what you think, I guess, is, because we could preface this in certain ways. We can kind of do what we think is the most influential and impactful JRPGs of each decade, and then we can list like our favorites, honorable mentions, just talk about like what was going on
Yeah.
in each. And you're a lot more knowledgeable than I am on all this, so you're gonna be, I'm kind of gonna be listening to you and deferring to you for
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, so I can establish some context from the 80s. So you already had some RPGs in the late 70s and the mid 70s. Of course, you have things like Dungeons and Dragons, which we can set as the starting point because anything before that is going to be war games, right? But
Mm-hmm.
then D&D influences amateur computer developers who make games like Colossal Cave Adventures, and then ultimately Wizardry and Ultima, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this is, I think, 1981 for the Apple II.
Yeah.
Um, and Japanese developers are getting their hands on these two games for a variety of reasons. One of the most notable developers is Nihon Falcom, who everyone knows these days for the Trails in the Sky series, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like 40 games
Skies of
long.
Arcadia, all that shit.
And so Nihon Falcom is selling Apple II products out of a computer store in Tokyo. And so they're heavily influenced by Ultima and Wizardry. I think the 80s is going to be one of the few decades where I would say because of technological progression, the games are getting better, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are cases where someone would say, well, I prefer games from 2002 for stylistic reasons over 2010, where I'm not really sure that's the case in the 80s, right? Because the early games, really, really rough RPGs from 1982, 1983. You have Panorama Toe by Nihon Falcom, which is this weird open world game with a bit of survival elements to it that's taking influence from Ultima. Koei, who people know for Dynasty Warriors and Romance of the Three Kingdoms, they're
Mm-hmm.
actually making an assortment of pornographic games during this era that they don't really talk about anymore. And so I was reading an interview with Koei's president and his wife. The two of them founded the company. And he goes, yeah, our first games were strategy games, like Nobunaga's Ambition, without
Mm-hmm.
mentioning these type of pornographic games that were getting them money. But these pornographic games were RPGs in the sense that there was some dungeon crawling, there were some random battles, but it's very, very primitive.
Mm-hmm.
And so really it's with 1984 that Nihon Falcom releases Dragon Slayer, which is an action RPG. And then you get Dragon Quest by Enix and Chunsoft, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
Dragon Quest really lays the foundation. This game is very easy to play. And I think partially we have to thank Nintendo for this. The
Mm-hmm.
whole thing with the Famicom was, well, is it a computer or is it a children's toy, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
being sold at computer stores, it's being sold at toy stores, like Kittyland, which is really famous and still open to this day. There are a lot of YouTube videos of people going all the way out there. It's in this type of plastic shell that has a really nice design. It's located in the living room where the family is playing. So
Mm-hmm.
if you think about computers back then, like the PC-88, they were seen as tools for business, right? This is where I'm going to do labor. And then if something's in the living room, it's where I'm going to have fun. And so all this is to say that with the Famicom, anyone can use it. It's just plug in and play. In Dragon Quest, you don't really have a party to make. You don't really have statistics to worry about. There is a semi-open world element to it, but it's still
Hmm.
very simple. And so, Dragon Quest lays a foundation for that. And I think it is in the 3 years after Dragon Quest, so up to 1989, this is where you start to see RPGs come out and developers start to refine them. And so that first half is really rough, right? It goes back to
Yeah.
those games like Panorama Toe. Although here, I do want to shout out tabletop role-playing games because Japan was
Hmm.
coming out with quite a bit of their own, including a Star Trek TTRPG that
Really?
was never released in America. Yeah, it was developed by a company known as Sukuda Hobby, 1983. But they did release a game called Roads to Lord in 1984. And this is considered the first Japanese tabletop role-playing game. So it
So
precedes even Dragon Quest.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I feel like my brother, to preface this, was a very large fan of Star Trek. He had
Yeah.
every episode on VHS. He had all types of like memorabilia, all this shit. I think he may have had the tabletop version of that game because I remember a box that may or may not have been in like Japanese, Chinese, some type of like Asian. I just remember like lettering on the box, and it
Yeah.
was like a weird. Um, it was a very strange game. It wasn't like a board game. I was like, I don't know what the hell this is, and I was really young. Um, and this had to have been in like the early to mid '90s. That I remember him having that, and like Star Trek, I had no idea that Star Trek was kind of like in that space. But now when you mentioned it, I was like, oh shit, I had like a memory. So I don't know if he got that thing from Japan somehow or how
Yeah, I
limited it
mean,
is, but
it wouldn't be too surprising only because when I've spoken to vendors at anime conventions,
Mhm.
they've talked about, well, before we had these really big anime conventions, like, Comic-Con might as well be anime adjacent these days, and Anime NYC, Star Trek served as like a de facto anime convention. So people would go to Star Trek conventions to do Star Trek stuff, but then people would have tables for D&D and other forms of nerd culture. And
Mhm.
so around this time, you had a lot of fan subbing and people trading tapes across the Pacific. So I would not be surprised if like a diehard otaku from the mid to late 80s got their hands on a Star Trek TTRPG and somehow your brother was able to get his hands on it too.
Yeah, man. I when you mentioned it, it just kind of like popped into my head, and I was like, wait a minute, I remember something like that, and my brother had it. So it is crazy. And then now that you mentioned it, it's true. There was a lot of like a big cross section, I guess, with like sci-fi, and I guess
Yeah,
there's also a deeper like conversation to be had about like I guess nerd culture at that time was like very all encompassing.
yeah,
And I don't know if that's
absolutely.
necessarily the case anymore. I feel like it's a lot more fragmented and everyone's kind of like split into like niches and it's almost gotten like what's the word I'm looking for? Like almost like clandestine maybe. Like
Hmm.
it's there's a lot of little like splinter groups of people and even back in when I was growing up like nerdy shit wasn't like cool. Um
Right.
and now it's like it almost is. And I guess that was I noticed like the largest influx of that happening during the Marvel movie kind of craze and superhero movie craze that kind of
Yeah, for
happened,
sure.
which started like a boom in comic books, and then all other nerdy shit people started branching out and finding other nerdy shit. But when I was a kid, I remember all of that stuff was kind of in the same place and like synonymous with one another, like comic books, Star Trek, anime, video games. Like if you were a nerd, it was all encompassing, like sci-fi, anything like futuristic, anything from like Japan, video games, anime, and then now it's like tiers of nerddom almost, where it's like, oh, Star Trek's too nerdy for me, and it's
Hmm.
and it's still, I guess, like that weird dichotomy exists in a way. But yeah, man, you mentioned something about and I feel like this is something that's the case, I guess, for all video games at the time, that like JRPGs were, there was in the 80s, it was a time like even late 70s 80s was a time where you had a lot of variety in types of games in general, and the mechanics and how they played, and it was, to your point, there wasn't a specific standard set.
Yeah,
So
exactly,
a lot
exactly.
of people and a lot of different types, this is all platformers, JRPGs, action games, puzzle games, whatever was coming out around the time. There were no standard set because the video game industry was kind of like in its infancy. And I feel like in a way, you had mentioned earlier that like there's not that large of a difference in terms of like gameplay and mechanics. There's like very small little I guess changes that have happened since like the early 2000s to even now. Or even the mid 2000s to now.
Yeah.
It's where those basic like concepts were kind of set, and I feel like the 70s 80s, in terms of video games, you'll probably find the most out there, ridiculous, good or bad gameplay mechanics and
Yeah.
kind of little nuances within each game that you play that don't really exist today, where like everything is almost like a, I don't want to say cookie cutter, because there's still some really like interesting and inventive gameplay mechanics out there that exist in all these different genres and subgenres. But and I guess that's more to say with like creativity and like the type of money that's in gaming now, and how, you know, people aren't really willing to take risks because there's so much money involved, and if something fails, and it's a much deeper conversation. But you're I feel like you're very on the money when you mentioned the the difference in quality and mechanics of each decade, and how as time went on, it's gotten, you know, it's gotten more and more rigid and less kind of inventive and out there and unique.
Yeah, so the one example I'd want to touch upon and recommend to your viewers is a short little film called Daikon 3 and Daikon 4 by the creators who would go on to establish Studio Gainax and direct Neon Genesis Evangelion and Fooly Cooly.
One of my favorites.
But they make this short anime film for a sci-fi convention, and you watch this thing and you're going to see references to Gundam, Godzilla, and Macross, but also Star Wars and Star Trek. And I'm sure if Dragon Quest had been released at the time of, you know, this movie's development, you would see a lot of more explicit swords and sorcery stuff there too. So that's just to say that the sort of barrier between Japanese role-playing games to anime to sci-fi to fantasy to all these other subgenres like was non-existent. And so the other anime I would recommend is also by Studio Gainax called Otaku no Video, which is about a college otaku who falls into a group of friends, and each of them has their own specialty. So one of them knows a lot about the military and model guns. Another one is a professional cosplayer. Another one is really good at special effects and animation. And then another one's like developing a game, right? And so they all have their own specialties, but they're in this shared club that wouldn't necessarily be a sci-fi club, wouldn't necessarily be an anime club. And this was the case in real life. So some of the first D&D players in Japan were at sci-fi college clubs, where they were like getting their hands on this material and translating it themselves. But yeah, as you were pointing out from what I was saying, what you're getting in the early half of the 80s are those primitive RPGs that are doing whatever. So that one example I keep going back to, Panorama Toe, it's not even swords and sorcery. It's not even King Arthur. It's based off this old mystery horror novel written by a different Japanese author. And so it has a wildly different aesthetic than what we would, you know, come to understand. And then sort of on the other spectrum of that, you have something like Phantasy Star, right? Which is clearly here sort of medieval inspired, but wait, is that a lightsaber? Well, what comes out in the mid 70s, the late 70s? Oh, it's Star Wars, right? And so, hey, this is a sci-fi medieval RPG, right? And so you really have this as you're pointing out, this beautiful mix of mechanics that don't work that well,
Mm-hmm.
beautiful clashing of different forms and aesthetics. Um, and I guess one of the honorable mentions I want to point out here to sort of start getting into the weeds of the 80s is the PC market. So Nihon Falcom had been
Mm-hmm.
developing games for the PC. Nintendo, obviously, or not Nintendo, but Chunsoft making games for the Nintendo, and then Sega making games for their own Sega consoles. And yet you had a smattering of developers still making games for the PC-88 and later the PC-98 and other different Japanese computers. And I recently stumbled onto this game called Deegan's Magic Stone or Deegan no Maseki. It was developed by a company called Art Tech. And this game has gorgeous, gorgeous art direction. You look at the box art, you're like, wow, I need to play that. And
Yeah.
then you boot it up and you're like, what the hell is this? This game, it doesn't look that great. You have to get a job in order to raise your stats. You get hungry, you have to go to sleep. It
It's
has
like
all these
Shenmue.
yeah, it has all these simulation elements to it because that was the thing. And so war games in Japan were called simulation games. And even up until 20 years ago, when a RPG has like a tactical battle system, it'll be called a simulation battle
Mm-hmm.
system, right? And so, well, every game needs to have these simulation aspects. So Deegan's Magic Stone is a great example of a game that one has really great art direction, but two has some mechanics that just haven't aged that well. Only because to give a concrete example, your character is really weak.
Mm-hmm.
And so you go to basically the job center in the town, and there's a list of jobs, and you can't do the hardest ones. So you do the cheapest one, and all that happens is the screen fades to black. You get your money, you go to bed, you come back in, you do the same job, you go to bed, you come, and you just grind this over and over and over.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's not that much depth to it, right? And that was 1989, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's at this point you're going to start seeing JRPGs sort of lose those elements and become more quote unquote JRPG, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, your viewers can comment on this, but if you ask someone, well, what makes a JRPG a JRPG? Most people would say they're linear, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't really have an impact on the narrative. Usually it's turn-based combat, right? All these elements that were coming from Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. So, what are your thoughts on this? Like, what makes the JRPG a JRPG by the late 80s?
By the late 80s. So I have a very limited scope in like 80s JRPGs from like a Japanese perspective. Like I have my experience with most 80s JRPGs is from a very Western perspective. So what I think kind of like the standard JRPG elements of a JRPG game of the 80s would probably be something like I was going to say Dragon Warrior, but Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest is probably like the standard for me. It's like those very I guess like rudimentary like fight magic run item, like you're just kind of in a static screen fighting some type of enemy and you only have a limited amount of moves that you can do, and when you're not fighting enemies you're in kind of like a very limited space that's kind of like semi-open world but not really.
Exactly, right?
And then you're
This
navigating
is
a very like generic storyline of like good versus evil. You gotta save the princess, or you gotta like a kingdom that you're like some emissary of a kingdom, and the ruler is now evil, and you have to go and save the world or something. Which Final Fantasy was also very similar at that time. The first Final Fantasy has kind of like a very similar concept. But it was all very like rudimentary things that were kind of based. I feel like you mentioned much earlier in the show, like on D&D in a way, where it's kind of like you have some of these elements of D&D in there, but you're making it into its own unique, specific quest within a D&D game instead of like just you know, having a dungeon master and like a bunch of people involved. It's almost like a your unique story, but it's already kind of like predetermined for you. Um,
Yeah, I think um you're right on the money on this, right? With a lot of these early Japanese role-playing magazines, this is what writers were saying. They were, when role-playing games were first coming out, they were sort of theorizing them and saying, well, you have a dungeon master and you have rules and you have imagination, and
mhm.
this is what makes a role-playing game a role-playing game. But obviously, in the transition to computers, you're quite limited by your imagination, or I think it works differently because if I'm playing D&D and I say my character jumps and does 4 slashes and spins around in the, I can do that, right?
Mhm.
I can't do that in Dragon Quest, right? But I think what's going on instead, and this is sort of a tangential point, is that when you
Mhm.
see those type of 8-bit graphics, your head is filling in the gaps of
Yeah.
what's happening, right? Of course, by today's standards, they don't look that great, right?
Oh
But
no, yeah.
when you're a child, you're like, oh no, this dragon is really fierce, and on screen it looks like this, but in my head, it looks like Unreal Engine 20 or
Mhm.
whatever, right? But this is just to say that it's the computer algorithm that is being your dungeon master at this point. And so what ends up happening is that things like Deegan's Magic Stone, things like Dragon Quest III, they have these simulation elements to it. So Deegan's Magic Stone has hunger, you need to get a job, whereas Dragon Quest III has time cycles, right?
Mhm.
Um, which we don't really think of this as like where does time cycles come from? Is that a Western role-playing element? Is that a Japanese role-playing element? But my larger point is that with the inclusion of like more manga artists that are
Uh-huh.
working on video games with these type of more anime graphics, with multimedia marketing, so Nihon Falcom, especially with something like Ys and their later
Mm.
Legend of the Hero series, they start doing anime adaptations, they start having merchandise, they start hiring pop idols, they start doing all these things that you're not seeing in Western role-playing games, right?
Mhm.
And so I guess if I were to really get down into it and say what I think is the most influential game of the 80s, I think by far and away, it just has to be Dragon Quest III. It just
Yeah.
has to be.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that sentiment. Um and I played Dragon Warrior, so it's the same game. But that's not my favorite game, I would say, of the 80s probably, but that's definitely the most impactful, and I think it had the
Yeah.
largest, I guess, cross um like I guess east and west reach, like worldwide reach rather. Then because there are some games that are super popular in the West and they weren't popular at all in Japan, and then there's certain games that are really popular in Japan and then weren't popular here at all. Same thing with
Well,
like anime, same thing with you know uh any type of product from anywhere in the world. Like there's just sometimes you don't get that critical acclaim across all borders, and that box art is fire. That kind of reminds me of Berserk.
yeah, it was done by a Japanese illustrator called Naoyuki Kato, who had been doing a lot of illustrations for Japan's SF magazine and the MSX console gaming
Hmm.
magazine. Had also worked for Space Battleship Yamato and the Legend of the Galactic Heroes. He had designed the spaceships. So he was really well renowned. And whenever he worked on a video game, that alone is enough to get someone interested in it. But as I said, despite the strong art direction, the game just seems to have a bit of that early JRPG primitive aspect to it.
Yeah.
So,
Um, I
so
think before fucking Zoom fucked us just now. Um, I think I was talking about what I think the most influential game of the 80s was, right?
yeah, and you were mentioning how some games have this sort of appeal across both Japan and the US. And the point I want to bring up is that strangely enough, Dragon Quest III did not have the same appeal in the United States as it did
Mm,
in Japan.
yeah.
I think for a lot of the early JRPGs, there are several issues here. The first and foremost is they were being localized quite slowly. So, for example, Japan gets Hyde in the early 1980s. This is a sort of open world bump combat action game.
Hmm.
Hyde gets localized in the US years later, and by the time Hyde is released in the US, we already have something like The Legend of Zelda, which is
Yeah.
a landmark game. Some people don't consider it a role-playing game. I certainly consider Zelda 1 and 2 as part of, I mean, Zelda 2 especially as
Yeah.
role-playing games. But the point being here is that by the time people get their hands on some of these JRPGs, they're like, oh, why would I play this? This is ass. I can go
Yeah.
play Dragon Warrior 3 or I can play Phantasy Star. I don't necessarily think that's the case with Dragon Quest in the US of being localized too late, although Nintendo is giving away free copies with Nintendo
Hmm.
Power by the time it comes out.
Yeah.
I don't really know like why it's unpopular because it's being localized when the earlier Final Fantasies are not, and the series continues to get localized. So I don't think you can really point towards it as being a financial failure. But to
Yeah.
talk about what's happening in Japan when Dragon Quest III comes out, I've been going back and looking through some old archival newspapers, and there are stories, for example, of brothers getting into fist fights with one another, children skipping school, scalpers selling the game out of the back of trucks. So all those rumors you've heard about how crazy people were going over Dragon Quest, it was true, and
Hmm.
as far as I've seen, that really starts with Dragon Quest III. So it's by this point that when Yuji Horii had released Dragon Quest I, the wider public still didn't understand what an RPG was because
Yeah.
most people that were playing the games that were playing RPGs were, they're already aficionados of war games or computer
Hmm.
systems or something. But remember, the Famicom is being aimed at children. And so
Well,
in talking about like how RPGs are part of this wider ecosystem of nerd culture, Yuji Horii had a column in Shonen Jump. So it's not only that Akira Toriyama had provided the art for Dragon Quest, but Horii was writing these video game columns in Shonen Jump explaining this is what a video game is, this is what an RPG is, this is what an HP bar is, all these uh, sort of points of grammar that we take for granted, right?
yeah.
That people just didn't know what they were. So it was after that that Dragon Quest 1 starts to sell really well, Dragon Quest 2 starts to sell really well, and then DQ3 starts the Dragon Quest craze over in Japan.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this very briefly, is like the difference in that time period between like computer games and um console video games, and I think that just sparked a thought in my head that like I don't know how much that really mattered in terms of like I think in Japan it was probably a lot more important. I think in maybe the West it was a little different. I feel like the video game space at that time, and now this isn't the case at all anymore, but in
Mm.
that time frame, everything was very splintered. Where like if you played PC games, you were playing like primarily games like maybe like Quake and like Command and Conquer and like StarCraft and RTSs and certain games of that kind of genre during that time on PC and console. There was a stark difference between both I guess gamer communities and what they kind of got out of video games in that time. Like if you were gaming on a PC, those were typically the things that you were playing, and if you were gaming on a console, you were playing like a lot of platformers, action games, and that stuff didn't really translate as well to PC. It was a completely different type of market. And I feel like even on PC, and you could probably allude to this and give me more information on this because I'm not really sure at that time, what was like the big difference in like JRPGs or even RPGs in general, like console versus PC? Like I know Dragon Quest and a lot of the franchises we're familiar with today were console based, but were there like strong RPGs in Japan or even that made its way over to the West on PCs at the time, or no?
I think you have the case of something like the Black Onyx, which is released I have to double check this, but I think at least in Japan, something like the Black Onyx released in 1984 comes out for both PC systems and consoles. Strangely enough, the lead director of this game is not even Japanese. I think he's Danish, and he had moved to Japan to follow his then girlfriend, now Japanese wife. Well, what I would say is that because the term role-playing game is so tenuous, you have all these experimental games
Hmm.
in Japan. If I asked you, hey, is Civilization 1 an RPG? You'd probably say, probably not, right?
It's more like a
But
RTS, maybe, right? In
but
a
then
way.
if you look at something like Koei, who's now Koei Tecmo, and their Nobunaga's Ambition series, and later on something like I think it's called like the Great King Bandits of China, the Bandit Kings of China. They're advertising those games as historical role-playing epics,
Hmm.
right? And so they're not RPGs in the way that we think about them, but that term was so nebulous back then that you did have a rich assortment of RPGs in Japan for
Hmm.
PC systems. You mentioned sort of the American gamer base playing things like Doom and Quake, but you also had things like Ultima Underworld. You
Yeah.
had Heroes of Might and Magic. You had Fallout. You had the classic CRPGs that people generally associate with Western role-playing games, right? The
Yeah.
biggest of them all is something like Daggerfall, and so.
Yeah.
This is interesting because we're saying, okay, Dragon Quest III is by far and away probably the most influential game of the 80s, only because Chunsoft had already developed two games beforehand. They sort of knew how to polish the genre by this point, and it's standing firmly between these design philosophies between Japan and the United States. But look at something like Final Fantasy II. This is a game that people hate. It didn't come out
That
in
game
the US.
sucks, man.
It
Yeah.
didn't come out in the US because they were already making Final Fantasy IV and they were like, we should just do this instead. But people hate this game in particular because it has a proficiency-based leveling system. And so for viewers that don't know what that is, that means in Final Fantasy II, when you want to level up a stat, you level it up by doing an action that relates to that stat. So if you want to have more health, your character needs to get hit. If your character doesn't get hit, your health will never increase. If you want your magic to be stronger, you have to use magic. That sounds absurd to a JRPG fan these days. They would say, what?
Yeah.
That's so weird and alien. But if I gave you the Elder Scrolls V
Yeah.
Skyrim, you'd be so happy.
Yeah.
You'd be in the, well, why? Why? Right? And of course, I know the reason why. It's more of a rhetorical question. But my larger point is that Final Fantasy II is sort of doing something. It's sort of like proto Elder Scrolls, but it's a Final Fantasy game, right?
Hmm.
That game even has like a keyword system that it uses, and so does Deegan's Magic Stone. Does that make the game good? No, but
Hmm.
my larger point is that it's a wildly experimental time, and
Yes.
so the barriers between role-playing games and other genres is tenuous. The barrier between role-playing games and other forms of media like anime
Hmm.
is tenuous.
Yes.
So
100%.
if you're to ask me what my favorite game of the 80s would be, it's a really hard choice. Some honorable mentions I did want to talk about is the Final Fantasy Legend by Square, released for Game Boys in
Yes, the
1989.
Game Boy. Yeah.
And sort of a successor to Final Fantasy II. So Final Fantasy II had been directed by Akitoshi Kawazu, who had directed the battle system for Final Fantasy I. And Kawazu is a big board game aficionado.
Hmm.
And one of the things that he brings to the combat system of Final Fantasy I is elemental weaknesses. And he takes that from D&D. So the idea
Hmm.
that if you're fighting something that's made of ice, you're going to, use fire, right? If you give any child a Pokemon game, they will naturally understand this, right?
Hmm.
And so Final Fantasy II sort of crashes and burns, but Nintendo needs something for, their new portable console, and Square says, "Hey, we're not going to let you touch the mainline Final Fantasy series
Yeah.
anymore. But why don't you go in this corner and you do your own thing?" And so this is a start of the Saga series, right? And so
Hmm.
there's a lot I really appreciate about the Final Fantasy Legend, especially because Kawazu can lean into these shorter narratives that are more reminiscent of a tabletop campaign, right? So hey, we have a
Hmm.
one shot to do that. That's all you're getting, right? You have a proficiency-based level system. You have like these weird things like certain jobs can only level up by buying stats from shops. Certain jobs level up by eating other monsters, right? But I don't think it comes together as well as the later Saga games. So
Hmm.
I think the most influential game of the 80s is Dragon Quest III. I think honorable mention is the Final Fantasy Legend. Um, as far as my favorite game of the 80s would be, I would say it might be Bandit Kings of China by Koei, only
Mm.
because this game is so replayable. This game offers so much depth, especially for something of the late 80s. I think if you're not used to playing old computer games, some people might think it's, well, what would you say, clunky
Yeah.
or whatnot. And some role-playing purists would say it's not a role-playing game. I think it is, right? I think
Hmm.
in the 80s it's really hard to draw these lines. I wouldn't say something like Mountain Blade Warband is a role-playing game necessarily,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
I know after a certain point, then people would say, well, why isn't Metroid Prime a role-playing game? You're role-playing as Samus. But something like the Bandit Kings of Ancient China does have statistics, does have
Hmm.
strategy, is coming from the simulation background of earlier role-playing games that I'm not really worried about genres here.
Yeah.
So
Um. Yeah. I agree. I definitely think the most influential game, and I was touching on this earlier before Zoom took us out. Um, is definitely Dragon Quest just because it had the most mass appeal that it broke all barriers. It was popular in the West. It was also popular in Japan. It kind of set the standard of what JRPGs were kind of going to become. And it was kind of like eventually in the West, I think Final Fantasy may have taken that helm over in a way, especially
yeah,
in later generations. But at first, it
yeah.
was definitely Dragon Quest that was kind of like the preeminent force in that. Um, and if I had to say, I guess what my favorite was of the 80s, because I enjoyed Dragon Quest, but I don't know if it was my favorite. And I don't even necessarily know if this is my favorite because it's not my favorite of the series, but
Yeah.
probably Mother 1 because Mother 1 was
Mm,
89, right? Was that 89 or 88?
yeah, it's the 80s.
Um and Mother 1 in comparison to like Mother 2 and 3 is dog shit. So like
Yeah, yeah.
I hate to, but as a series, the Mother series is one of the greatest JRPG series ever made. And the first game kind of sets that the tone for the rest of the series. And while it's an imperfect game, I think it's a very important um, introduction into the series. And I would probably put that as my favorite, even though it's not my favorite in the series.
I 200% understand that, and I think that's part of the issue with something like this. Which at the end of the day,
Yeah.
these lists are not like meant to be gospel.
Oh
They're not
yeah.
meant to be that serious. But even my encounter with Earthbound, like I had no idea it was Mother 2, and then when I learned about,
Hmm.
oh, it's called Mother and there's Mother 1, I'm like, how come no one talks about this
Yeah.
game, right? And it's most like, oh, you just play it to get it out of the way to eventually play, Earthbound 2, or Mother 2 and 3, which are much better.
Yeah. I didn't play Mother 1 until after Mother 2. Um, so the first one that I played was Earthbound, and then I found out afterwards that there was a first one, and I was like, "What for the NES?" And then I played that one, and then I was like, "Oh, this is cool." Um, for me, it's really hard to say which is better, 2 or 3, but I think one was definitely the a great introduction, and I would say probably my favorite of the 80s, but I also don't have a lot of experience in like 80s JRPGs. I feel like I have a very like Western kind of understanding of the JRPG genre of the 80s, where it's like Final Fantasy 1 and 2, the early Dragon Quest games,
Yeah.
Mother. I'm trying to think of some other really popular games that kind of like made their journey over here.
I mean, on the one hand, there is like a small handful. On the other, there's not that much. So like
Yeah,
between Phantasy Star 2 and like Final Fantasy 1 and DQ 3, I mean that's your like your
yeah,
Trinity right there. I mean, of course the first Legend of Zelda, which I also think is really
I would put
really
that. Yeah.
fantastic, and that could almost be my number one, only because I feel that there's so much about that game that still has aged well and is incredibly
Oh,
fun to
definitely.
play.
Yeah, definitely. I think
But
I was playing through Link to the Past on my stream recently. We just beat it yesterday, and I was talking about with everyone in the stream about the Zelda franchise, and the first game I feel like is definitely, if we want to consider it like a JRPG, which I definitely do, is one of the most important games of all time, and you might even be able to argue that that's more important than Dragon Quest. Um,
that's tough. That's a
yeah,
real
yeah,
tough one.
that's a very it's a very specific conversation to have too, because it's kind of like they both spawn different things.
I
Um,
feel that everyone knows Zelda,
yeah,
and not everyone knows Dragon Quest. I think DQ11 really helped its international popularity, but I knew adults that knew Zelda because their kids played it.
but we're also, I feel like, kind of looking at it through a Western lens, and also Zelda kind of spawned different things. Like Dragon Quest kind of went on to create like the JRPG turn-based genre in a sense, and
Hmm.
then Zelda spun off of that and then made like the action adventure RPG genre. So it's like two different like subgenres within like the
Well,
role playing.
I I think it's Nihon Falcom that makes the ARPG. What Zelda does really well, I think, is
Mhm.
that type of overworld exploration using
Yeah.
specific items to like
Hmm.
move through areas while also like refining that action combat that you had been
Hmm.
seeing in games like Xanadu and Dragon Slayer. So once again, these games from the late 80s, like they're being polished, they're being refined. Maybe
Hmm.
not the case of like Final Fantasy 2 or Mother 1, as you pointed out, but those games still have very strong
Oh
merits
yeah.
to them.
Yeah. It's the 80s, and we talked about this briefly earlier. The 80s, I feel like, was a very important and experimental time for games, and it definitely paved the way for um, modern games. But I wish we almost, in a sense, had that same type of like creativity and experimentation in games. But I think the 80s were so important because they paved the way for the 90s, which I think is the fucking golden age
Yeah.
of JRPGs and just kind of like even RPGs in general. Sorry. Um, so without the 80s, we wouldn't have like these classics, timeless classics that we have from the 90s. Um, and that went on to
Yeah.
kind of inspire some of the games we have today, those classics from the 90s.
Yeah, so to move into the 90s, I think what makes this particularly hard is that when we're talking about the 80s, we're really talking about a small handful of consoles and
Hmm.
technological jumps. Whereas in the 90s, you're really covering something, going from the Super Nintendo to the PlayStation 1, and then eventually ending with something like the Dreamcast. So much happens within those 10 years that uh, I think whatever we end up picking, people are going to be angry, right?
Hmm.
Because as you pointed out, you really love something like Super Mario RPG, and that's being made for the Super Nintendo. So if the late 80s was the point in time for developers to begin sort of perfecting their craft, right? So Dragon Quest 3 is the culmination of Dragon Quest 1 and 2. What ends up happening in the early 90s is that you have developers catching up. And so this is where you get Final Fantasy IV's focus on narrative,
Hmm.
right? Um, I mean, Final Fantasy 2 had this as well because it opens up in media res with the characters, being killed by the Emperor, so on and so forth. But Final Fantasy IV is like, here's this dramatic storyline, right? Here's this great battle with Cecil where he has to battle his inner demons and whatnot.
Hmm.
And this is where Final Fantasy, I think, really begins to hit its stride.
Yeah.
Although, shout out to Final Fantasy III and that job system. I think it's incredibly fun. And I think there are ways that the job system of 3 is being felt today in titles like
Yeah.
Bravely Default, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So you have companies that are catching up to Chunsoft. Ironically, Nihon Falcom starts to fall apart. They have a brain drain going on at this point in time, so a lot of their key development team is leaving. But then you have other companies like Nintendo. I think it's HAL Laboratory that makes Mother, or
Yes, HAL Laboratories, yeah.
yeah, so like how makes Earthbound. I think Square gets to experiment with Super Mario RPG, some weird subdivision of
Hmm.
Square. Uh, Nintendo approaches Akitoshi Kawazu and they're like, "Hey, we really like those weird Final Fantasy Legend games on the Game Boy. Can you make something for the Super Nintendo?" And he's like, "Watch me make an open world experimental JRPG, and it's going to be amazing. And I'm going to make three of them back to back." And he makes the Romancing Saga trilogy, right? And that's
Hmm.
the mid an open world game on consoles with an experimental job system that's non-linear. Why come that was never localized here?
Hmm.
What's going on there? Um, and so it's this really fertile period. What ends up happening by the late 90s is I think this is when JRPGs really start to hit their international stride. And we can really see this with something like Final Fantasy VII and Square pouring millions of dollars into advertising and budgeting for the game. So I had mentioned this to you before, but there's a movie theater commercial for Final Fantasy VII that was running in theaters that said, and now the greatest cinematic experience of the year will never come to a theater near you, right? And the whole
Yeah.
thing was using Final Fantasy FMVs, and there's only like 10 of them in the game, right? So
Hmm.
like you see Eris dying, you see
Yeah.
Sephiroth burning down Nibelheim, you see the weapons attacking Midgard and whatnot. And then I think Square is really the titan of this era
Oh,
for
without
several
a doubt.
reasons. And this is mostly because it's so strange. I'm still trying to find an answer for this. But one of the things that I want to point out is that in the 80s, Japan was undergoing an economic boom. Where if you watch a lot of American movies from the 80s, they're always talking about Japanese corporate businessmen. So let's look at Die Hard as an example. Die Hard
Hmm.
takes place in the Nakatomi Tower, right? This is a Japanese company. This is a Japanese corporation. Um, so there was always a presence of Japan as being like this super strong economic power.
Hmm.
By the early 90s, the economic bubble in Japan bursts, and you also have all these national tragedies that happen. So the emperor passes away around this time. You have an earthquake that absolutely decimates a large part of the country. You have a terrorist attack that happens. And things are really dire. They call this period the lost decade.
Hmm.
And despite that, Squaresoft still seemed to have the money to have like 30 different sub development teams all making RPGs back to back to back to back. Um, so you had Saga, you had Parasite Eve, you had Brave Fencer Musashi, you had Final Fantasy, you had a game about working chocobos on a farm. It was just called Working Chocobo. They were diverting resources to the Wonder Swan. Final Fantasy 9, 10, 11 all get announced at the same time, right?
Yeah.
This is what I'm saying, that for our generation, you are growing up in this really rich period where there
Hmm.
seems to be a Final Fantasy game or a Squaresoft logo slapped on something all
Everything,
the
man.
time, right? I mean, even in Japan, they make a racing game, a racing RPG called Racing Lagoon. What?
Yeah,
Why
I
not?
never even heard of that.
I look for you and your viewers, look it up, Racing Lagoon. It's really fantastic. It's really weird. Random battles take place when you're driving in the city and another car crashes into you. Then you race them. The whole screen swirls like a regular random battle screen, and then you race them. And when you beat them, you get to take a part of theirs and make your car more
That sounds
powerful.
a little ridiculous. That sounds like
This
almost
is
like
what
a
this is what I'm
racing JRPG.
it's exactly what it is. It's a racing JRPG. So this is what I'm saying, is that you have this odd contrast between sort of the economic reality of Japan during this era, right? So for viewers that have seen something like Evangelion or
Hmm.
Hideaki Anno's subsequent work, His and Her Circumstances, the characters are making explicit reference to this, especially in His and Her Circumstances, where there are opening monologues where they're like, we're teenagers, but Japan is undergoing an economic depression. So we're not sure what's going to happen to our future, right? Xenogears, Final Fantasy Tactics. I could
Yes.
go on and on and on, regarding Squaresoft. And unfortunately, it's at this point in time that even though you have a really rich JRPG scene, you also have many games that are not being localized for a variety of reasons. So something like Dungeons and Dragons during the 80s is going to
Hmm.
get attacked because of the satanic panic, right? The
Oh yeah.
idea that uh, playing games is the devil's magic. I mean, Pokemon is subjected to this as well, right? A
Yeah.
really important series we never get that Japan has was Shin Megami Tensei, which I didn't
Yep.
mention for the 80s, right? But you know, you mentioned Mother One being your favorite game. That's a game that's sort of not trafficking in Arthurian or Tolkien aesthetics. It takes place in
Hmm.
the American suburbs. What does SMT do? Well, SMT takes place in sort of modern day and then post-apocalyptic Tokyo. So you have an urban setting. There are no castles here. There's no swords and sorcery in the way that
Hmm.
we typically understand it. But in the 90s, SMT sort of starts to hit its stride with a variety of releases that never see a stateside release. Mostly we can, surmise for these type of religious reasons and
Hmm.
fervor that's going on in the US at the time. So even Xenogears is almost not released in the United States
Yeah.
because of the way this game draws upon Abrahamic religion.
Yeah, it's the 90s in general is in all, I guess, forms of art, in music, in movies, television, video games. Might even be able to argue like books and like literature. Um, the 90s is a very like profound era. Um, and you mentioned Xenogears and like Evangelion and thing and stuff earlier, and I feel like anime, I kind of view anime in a way where like you have post Evangelion and pre Evangelion, where Evangelion was doing things that would like nobody else was doing, and like trying to discuss like certain real life, um, like psychological, like illnesses and things like that um, in a different way, and trying to incorporate it into like kind of mainstream media, and I feel like in a way in the 90s I look in video games as like, and I guess this kind of leads into what I think is the most impactful game of that era, and it's such a fucking hard conversation to have because there are so many games in the 90s, especially within the JRPG genre, that are insanely impactful to the entire industry even today. But I feel like Final Fantasy especially, and just the JRPG genre, it's like pre Final Fantasy VII and post Final Fantasy VII. Um, and personally, like I don't necessarily know if Final Fantasy VII is my favorite. It's one of my favorite games ever, and I don't even know if that's because it's such a fucking competitive era, and like
Right.
it, you can compare this. It's so hard to compare. It's like in sports. You look at like the steroid, it felt like the steroid era of baseball where it's like
Mm,
there were so many guys that were just fucking hitting home. It's like Barry
yeah.
Bonds, Mark
Final
McGuire,
Fantasy
Sammy
7 has a
Sosa.
cork bat.
Yes, yeah, Final Fantasy VII has a corked bat. It's on steroids, but everybody else was on steroids too. Like you had Chrono Trigger, you had fucking sorry, my camera zooms when I get too animated and do certain hand movements. But you had Final Fantasy VII, you had Chrono Trigger, you had like Super Mario RPG, you had Xenogears, you had Shin Megami Tensei, you had
You even have Final Fantasy 6, right?
yeah, Final
People would
Fantasy
argue like,
6,
what?
9, like it's insane. And then all the little other spin-offs that you had, it's such a competitive era. And then even in when you look at other genres and games, like you can go on about other action adventure games and platformers and stuff of that era. It was just such an insane era in gaming, the 90s, and Earthbound 2, Earthbound, Mother 2, like you all of these games came out in this time, and then games that never even came over to like the States, like Terranigma and shit like that. Like there were so many insane JRPGs that it was such a competitive time, and it spanned like two console generations, really, almost three. because you had the SNES, you had the PlayStation 1, and towards the tail end of the SNES, a lot of great JRPGs started coming out. And then the PS1 was like a JRPG machine. And the engine that was running that machine was Squaresoft. Squaresoft was just pushing out. I don't know how they were doing it. And like sadly, the 2000s kind of became like the end of the Squaresoft era, which was probably the craziest like 10-year run I've ever seen in the video game industry ever, and will probably never be surpassed. But
Yeah, there are some things I want to mention as I slowly work my brain from no longer being mush after my first rant. But in terms of mentioning, what's going on with these other genres, like, yeah, absolutely. Look at something like Metal Gear Solid, right? Metal
yeah,
Gear Solid alongside Final Fantasy VII, really helping Sony to push that narrative of making these type of cinematic games. And this is a very loaded term because the other two trends I wanted to talk about during this era is that, okay, in the 80s, you have tabletop games and you have these sort of primitive computer games. What ends up happening in 1988, I just found out about this, but there's a Japanese TCG game released called Monster Maker. And I still have to do more research into what exactly Monster Maker was, like how people played it, how popular it was. But for anyone that knows anything about TCGs, well, what gets released in the mid 90s?
Magic the Gathering,
Magic
baby.
the fucking Gathering, right? And from what I've seen, Magic the Gathering was an immense influence
Oh,
on
it's
Japanese
insane.
developers in a way that America never sees. And so, for example, I had mentioned Akitoshi Kawazu before, but he ends up directing a game for the Wonder Swan called Wild Card, and that's released in 2000.
Oh yeah.
It's a dungeon crawling game controlled through cards. 1997, you have three Japanese card games that are released as video games. The first one being Cold Sept, and the other two, their names, I'm forgetting them. They're in the chat because I sent them to you. I sent you like this really long
Hmm.
paragraph and images
Yeah.
of them. But you have three JRPG card games that are all released in 1997. And so you have an entire genealogy of a subgenre that never gets released here. I mean,
Yeah.
of course, Magic is an American game, so we have Magic, and then later on we get Yu-Gi-Oh and
Hmm.
the Pokemon TCG. I think Pokemon TCG is less like RPG influence than something like Yu-Gi-Oh is, right? Because
Hmm.
for anyone that's like read Yu-Gi-Oh as a manga, that begins not as a card game, but like as the king of games. So he's playing a wide variety of different games.
Hmm.
That certainly took influence from D&D. And for anyone that remembers, Yu-Gi-Oh had like this really crappy spin-off game called like Dungeon Dice Monsters that just never took off. And they even made video game adaptations of this. So all this is to say is that, yeah, for America, the JRPG scene was really rich, but guess what? It was even richer than what we imagined it to be because of all these games that were never localized. So that's just card games. The other genre that we never get in America is a different type of simulation game genre that I think has become more popular these days thanks to Persona. And that's the idea that you're going to play a character that is attending school, that is
Yeah.
partaking in these daily activities. So I told you before about Konami's Tokimeki Memorial, which some people might not
Hmm.
consider an RPG, but that game has stats, right? That game has like branching endings and choices to make. And this eventually works its way into a number of other developers that are making something similar. So the developers behind a game called Kowloon High School Chronicle, it's like the fourth game in the series, and the name
Hmm.
is slipping my mind right now. But they're releasing this series in the late 90s. That's also about going to school. That's also about dating people. That's also about making the correct dialogue choices, right? And we're not seeing any of that. The biggest one would be Sega's Sakura Wars, which is one of the
Hmm.
best-selling titles
Yeah.
for the Saturn and Dreamcast. That's never localized here, but shout out to the translation teams that have brought out Sakura Wars 1 and 2, and they're now working on 3. So if you've never played them, I really recommend them. They're really fun. They're really charming. They're not that long of games, but they present an entire different historical take on how the JRPG genre evolved. So all this is to say is that I think it's really by this point where like, oh, games get better as we move forward in time. That stops being true because you can pick Final
Yeah.
Fantasy VI as like your first half of the 90s, and I think that can be as good as something from 1999. It's just a
Yeah.
really, really stacked decade.
It is. It's insane, man. And like, is Pokemon a JRPG? Because
Yeah, absolutely,
that shit was
100%.
insane too.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
it was such an era of just like video game masterpieces that went on to just inspire the entire industry. And some of those games, and this is a different, like, you can have a conversation about like, are games better in the past than they are now? And I think that's a very complex conversation. That's not something that can kind of be summarized in a yes or no. Although I tend to lean towards maybe a no. I think you can take like a Final Fantasy VII, and I think if you match it up with like the Rebirth games, the original is better. And I don't know if it's maybe because I'm biased, but I think we put too much stake now as like a, I guess, gaming community, or maybe it's just the average person that plays video games, because I don't necessarily consider like the I guess my term for or my idea of gamer is not is pretty rigid. It's not like a this open-ended thing. The average person that kind of plays games is way too concerned, I guess, with graphical fidelity and frame rates and all these things, that they're unwilling to kind of allow themselves to like older games. So
Yeah.
you might hand somebody both Final Fantasies and they're like, oh, this original game sucks because it looks
Yeah.
terrible. But it's like,
Yeah.
it's a better game mechanically. It's a better game story-wise. It's a better game exposition-wise. Story, like, that's the issue with a lot of modern Final Fantasies, and that's an issue that I have with like 16 when I started playing it, is it's just an immediate exposition dump for mad long that I don't really care about. Like, there's ways that you can do exposition in a creative and interesting way that the first Seven's exposition dump happens you're on a fucking speeding train and you jump off and there's bombs going off and you're doing all this shit and they're explaining you like the lore of the game in an interesting way. Like, it's not like the beginning of a Star Wars movie where they just do an exposition dump in text, but it somehow worked for Star Wars. But if you try to pull that off as anybody else, you're fucked. There's no way you're doing that. And I feel like Final Fantasy 16 did a really bad job of their, and I feel like that's an issue with a lot of modern games, is they don't know how to properly storytell, or I don't know. I don't know what the causation
Well, it's
for
what
is it.
it's what you're I think what you're pointing out is sort of this irony that arises out of Sony's PlayStation and being marketed as a cinematic console. One of the things that I do want to point out is something like the PC engine is also cinematic in its own right, and having some games have these like not necessarily high quality graphic cutscenes the way you would think about FMVs, but like really nice crisp anime visuals. And of course, the PC 98 at this time in Japan. If you've never seen it, just look up clips of PC 98 games and they all look absolutely gorgeous. So I don't want to put the entire onus on Sony, but it's really Sony that's able to move into the future and continue capitalizing on this idea of what cinematic means, right? And I think these days, as you're pointing out some of your frustrations, is that, well, for Final Fantasy VII, it meant having this cutting edge cutscene at the start of the game where you see Aeris walk through, the slums and Cloud jumping off the train. Towards when you play a cinematic game now, people mostly think you're following an NPC through town as they talk to you and explain to you something. That like very classic Assassin's Creed
Yes.
hallway simulation
It's
style.
terrible.
Right. We had been talking about live alive, live a live. I
Yes.
don't know how people pronounce it. I'm just going to go with whatever comes out my mouth at the time. But it's very interesting that the director of this game works on Live Alive, works on Chrono Trigger, and then the other game that we haven't mentioned from the 90s is Parasite Eve, which combines
yes.
Resident Evil with Final Fantasy, right?
Yes.
And this game gets marketed as a cinematic RPG explicitly, right? That's what's written on the box. It has really beautiful cutscenes and whatnot, but once again, an entirely different approach to how we understand this term of cinematic RPG.
Yeah, it's and it's not necessarily even just, I feel like I deviated a little, I'm sorry. I think it's all games in that era did an exceptionally good job at exposition. Like you mentioned, Metal Gear Solid. The intro to fucking Metal Gear Solid, you're in like a swimsuit and you land in some random area and you're listening to a phone call from the Colonel Campbell or whatever his name was. And he's explaining to you what the fuck is going on, and then you pull out of the swimsuit and there's guards everywhere and you got to try and escape. And the exposition is like incorporated into like the core experience of the game in an interesting
Mm-hmm.
way. And I feel like this is something that's very prevalent in the 90s and in the early 2000s, and then it starts to taper off when we get into like the more modern like 2010s and even now, where like the standards for storytelling kind of change in a way, and everything becomes more about graphical fidelity and frame rates and performance than like actual storytelling, gameplay mechanics, and how you navigate these worlds and the unique elements of it.
Yeah.
Everything becomes like very cookie cutter and it's all about graphics. And in the 90s, every game had some, and early 2000s too, I'll say. Um, and then, you know, modern games, it's just, it's kind of, it doesn't exist aside from a select few. And I don't know if this is an issue with like gamers per se. I don't want to blame them. I think it more so has to do with like the industry at large and how much money is circulating in the video game industry now, and the unwillingness to take risks from like a studio and I guess developer and investor standpoint. But that's also a deeper conversation that we can have. But are there like some other things about the 90s that you feel like you didn't hit on that
I
um
think there is one more thing, but it,
mhm,
it serves better because it when we talk about the 2000s, because of the way it segues into the genre I'm thinking about. So the last thing I wanted to mention is I looked up some of those games whose names slipped my mind. So if you're interested in the history of Japanese card-based video games, the three games that came out in 1997
mhm,
are Arcana Strikes, Concept, and Arcana Senki. If you're interested in the history of these type of Japanese simulation games that precede Persona by a whole decade, I would recommend Tokimeki Memorial, which the first game has been translated and is available to play. And then the other series that I had mentioned is called Tokyo Majin Gakuen Denki. And one game from related to this series has been translated for the Switch, and that's called Kowloon High School Chronicle. So once again, just some subgenres that we never got in America that I think make the JRPG genre all the more richer. So as far as what I would pick for most influential
mhm.
game, I think it's by far, in a way, it has to be Final Fantasy VII. This game cast a very, very long shadow over Squaresoft and now Square Enix. People who, I've said this before, but if you're born like in 2003, you're basically coming of age and you're like, wait, why are they making Final Fantasy VII three different times, right? Well, there's
Yeah.
a reason for that, right? We had to live
Yes.
through Advent Children. We had to live through a variety of Final Fantasy VII spin-offs. So it's just
Crisis
has
Core,
has
Dirge of
never ended.
Cerberus.
Yeah, exactly, right. And even those games are still being remade, right?
Yeah.
So Crisis Core received the remaster.
Reunion. Yeah.
I'm not calling those games bad or anything, but just to point out that with Final Fantasy VII in particular, it's not only successful in Japan, but it's also successful worldwide in a
Yeah.
way that Dragon Quest III, Dragon Warrior was not. One of the interesting things that I had noticed is that I think this is the first Final Fantasy game to be released for PCs. And so when
Hmm.
I've been going back
Oh
and doing
yeah.
archival research, I've been looking through Computer World magazine and finding ads for that game there. And it's so strange because up until this point, they're not really talking about JRPGs. There are some ways that Sega does seem to get like a lot of a lot of people who are into computer RPGs like Sega games. I'm not going to go into that rant right now because that'll sidetrack us, but it's really Final Fantasy VII that's sort of coming across as barrier, even though people don't remember it as like a multi-console game. It's not only released for PS1 but also for PCs as
Yeah.
well, and that's also the case for 8 and 9, right? After 9, you're not going to see another Final Fantasy game until 11, right? And then 13 is where Final Fantasy games properly enter the PC market, which do not, whatever you do, do not buy Final Fantasy 13 on Steam because the games do not work. I don't know how it's legal to still
Yeah,
sell
that's
them on
crazy.
there, but they do not work. Like I'm someone that knows how to mod games. I know what a file path is and all that, and these games still crash on me. It is extremely frustrating. So most influential game has to be Final Fantasy VII for the 90s. My favorite game, one little strand I hadn't mentioned are the RPGs that now that the genre has been established, they're sort of playing with the tropes, right? They're sort of either
Hmm.
poking fun at them or using them to explore different stories. One of your favorites, Earthbound, that's sort of the whole
Yeah.
point of this, right? You have this whole trope in JRPGs about the absent parent, and
Hmm.
Nessa's dad, from what I understand, he's not in the game, but you call him, right? To
Yeah.
be like, hey, I'm on this adventure, and I'm saving the game, right? It also takes place in 1950s American suburbs, which
Yeah.
is just so weird, right? It has like these
Yes.
strange influences. It seems like a video game directed by talking heads, right? Like the game is just really cool and wacky, right?
it
Um,
its narrative is also like extremely the game the premise is very simple, the story is very simple early on, but then by the end of the game it turns into this very wild, mind-bending, like
right.
reality altering, like subconscious psychological, like thriller. It's a very complex game. And I think that's why it was so popular for that time. And there's a lot of games like that in the 90s. It's just it was such a
Call of
uh,
Cthulhu in Japan at this time starts to really soar. And to this day, Call of Cthulhu is the number one tabletop role-playing game in Japan.
really.
It's never been Dungeons and Dragons. It was a game called Sword World RPG, but it's Call of Cthulhu, right? So,
Hmm.
you're referencing Gigas, right? Everyone knows Gigas and the
Yeah.
the strange final boss screen. That's not really a final boss, but that's totally part of this
Hmm.
Lovecraftian strain of RPGs.
It's you you shared your did you give your favorite specifically about the 90s?
No, so what I wanted to mention is that you have Earthbound, and alongside Earthbound, there are two more games I wanted to shout out. One is called Ihatovo Monogatari, which is more of an adventure game that I think is using the grammar of role-playing games. This was never released in the States, but there is a fan translation. It's a Super Nintendo game based off some short stories written by this Japanese author where you undergo these quests, or you're in this town visiting and you undergo these quests. They're very short. You can beat the game in like 2 days. I highly
Hmm.
recommend it. It's really beautiful and moving. That's not my favorite game of the 90s. My favorite game of the 90s would be the third game and what I think is a series of games that are playing with the JRPGs. And I've talked to you
Hmm.
about this before, but it's Moon Remix RPG
Yeah, I've
Adventure.
never played it. I want to though.
I've never played Undertale, right? That's also on my
Yes.
backlog, but a lot of people have come to learn about Moon because Toby Fox has talked about the influence that Moon has had on Undertale. So if you're someone that really likes contemporary, let's call them quote unquote quirky role-playing games like Omori or Undertale and such, I really recommend playing Moon. It was released for the PlayStation 1 by a development studio called Love Delic, which actually spun off from employees that had been previously working at Square. So they were quite familiar with the sort of tenets of the RPG genre. This game centers are around a boy who is playing a video game, beats the final boss, and then finds himself transported into the world of the video game. And so there are levels. There's a hunger meter, sort of. You have to go to sleep, but there are
Yeah.
no random battles. Instead, as you progress through the game, you're seeing the hero of the game kill everyone, and so your job is to sort of save these monsters that have been killed by this hero. It's very dark, but also
Hmm.
really humorous and wacky. And so we had been mentioned Evangelion before, but I think some of the messaging of Moon is quite similar to
Hmm.
Evangelion. I mean, 1997 was a killer year for Japanese media. You had
Oh yeah.
Yoshi Kurosawa's Cure, you had Final Fantasy VII, you had Satoshi Kon's Perfect Blue, and now you also have Moon, right?
Yeah.
Moon is eventually translated into English and released for Nintendo Switch and contemporary consoles, so you can pick it up these days quite easily. But I just really like that this game is, not only part of this sort of postmodern turn of the 90s, as you were saying before, right? The 90s are very profound point in time. But it's still coming relatively early on, and I don't think it's deconstructing or necessarily criticizing the RPG genre. I don't think it's saying it's bad, but I do like its messaging towards how we can use RPG systems to think about our relationship to the world. And then my runner-up would be Romancing Saga 3, which was never localized upon release, but we later get it as part of this Saga Renaissance. This is an open world game. There are no fixed character classes. It is non-linear. So what I really like about this game is undertaking all these smaller quests as you eventually work your way towards saving the world. I really like these type of emergent narratives that can happen between different playthroughs. So no one playthrough is going to be the same. And I just love being able to make my own classes. So if I want someone to use a spear and use lightning, they'll use a spear and be lightning. And in my head, I'll call them like a lightning paladin or something, you know?
Yeah.
So I love the freedom of Romancing Saga 3.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So your favorite of the 90s?
Yeah, the thing with the 90s is there's so many fucking games. Like I'm
Yeah, you really can't go wrong.
I'm just if I pull up a list right now, it's like Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII, Chrono Trigger, Xenogears, Super Mario RPG, Phantasy Star, Earthbound, Suikoden, Secret of Mana, Parasite Eve, Panzer Dragoon, the Tales games, Final Fantasy Tactics, and then you have all the later Final Fantasies like 8, 9, the Breath of Fire
I don't
games.
think anyone's gonna say Final Fantasy 8.
Oh
but
yeah, that game sucks.
I think if you asked me 10 years ago, I would have told you I love Final Fantasy Tactics. I think that would have been my favorite.
It's just there's so many games to choose from, like Grandia, Lunar, Pokemon, Dragon Quest was still really good at the time. Ogre Tactics.
Oh yeah. I really like I mean the PSP remake is called Let Us Cling Together. But I prefer Let Us Cling Together over Final Fantasy Tactics, and that might get me crucified, but I think they're quite similar, and I would take either or on a good day. But there were a lot of things that I came to see in Tactics Ogre that I had wished was in Final Fantasy Tactics, and mainly that's sort of the branching narrative of the game.
Yeah, there was just so much, man. It's so hard to pick. Like, definitely, I think the most influential is Final Fantasy VII, and like, there's so many games that I like. Like, I just went and listed all of those games that I loved during that decade, but it's like a coin flip. I think my favorite, and also a coin flip for the most impactful, is like Chrono Trigger and 7. But I feel like I have to lean towards 7 being the most impactful and my most favorite, because like the worldwide acclaim that 7 kind of garnered, the soundtrack, Nobuo Uematsu during this time was like fucking Mozart, dude. Like Nobuo Uematsu was everywhere in the JRPG genre during this time and was just dominating it and creating like classic, timeless masterpieces in terms of like video game music. And the Final Fantasy VII soundtrack is one of the best easily in the entire franchise. The world, the way you navigated the world, it kind of set the precedent for even modern JRPGs now, like fucking Expedition 33. That how you navigate the world, the characters and character design of all of these characters, and the story, like the story was just insane. It was very similar to like Final Fantasy 6 in a way, and there was a lot of elements from like Final Fantasy 4 that were taken for Final Fantasy 7. So if you play Final Fantasy 4, there's a lot of elements in there that will be very reminiscent of Final Fantasy 7. But it's a near perfect game, and of course I don't think any game is perfect, but I think something can also be a masterpiece without it being a perfect game, and I would say Final Fantasy VII is a masterpiece and like a crowning achievement of the video game industry in the 90s. And it has it was supposed to be a fucking N64 game originally, and it they couldn't make it an N64 game because what they imagined, like the vision that they had for it, just wasn't possible with the technology that the N64 was using at the time. So there was like those tech demos coming out that they were doing of showing like all the Final Fantasy VI characters and these like 3D worlds and battles and shit, but it ended up not even coming out on the 64 because it just wasn't possible with what they were doing. And it's such an important game and impactful to the entire video game industry, not just the JRPG genre. And I think it has probably one of, if not the most memorable moment in all of games. And for spoiler alert, for somebody that hasn't played this game that's been out for 20 years, that is one of the most world-renowned and impactful video games ever made. If you haven't played it, spoiler alert, turn off the video. When fucking Sephiroth kills Aerith is one of the most impactful moments in all of video games. And in every Reddit forum that talks about video games, you'll probably find somebody mentioning it. It's just there's a lot of amazing games in that era, and like we were talking about earlier, it's like the steroid era in baseball for video games and especially JRPGs. But Final Fantasy VII was the Barry Bonds of that generation. You had the Mark McGuires like Chrono Trigger, the Alex Rodriguez, even though he was like I'll consider him the 90s, even though he was like just the steroid era in general. You had fucking Sammy Sosa, all these guys were on steroids, and they were all incredible and doing amazing things. But like the guy that was the best, and everyone was doing steroids, was Barry Bonds, and that's kind of what Final Fantasy VII was. It was just everyone was incredible at the time, but like he was the greatest. I think that's probably the masterpiece of the 90s, like undisputed.
Yeah, and it really breaks my heart to hear all these games. I think one notable thing to say is that we often think of Squaresoft as being the de facto RPG developers, but there are certainly developers who are not associated with RPGs, even making really great games. So like Suikoden, for example, no one really associates it's Konami, right?
Yes, I'm pretty sure it was Konami.
No one associates Konami with making JRPGs. Well, we think of something like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which we didn't even mention before, right?
Yeah.
But this game has like a level up system and whatnot. And I had just read an interview that part of the reason of this was because this sort of made the game easier to play for people. So if like you weren't doing really well, you could go level up. But once again, it wasn't just Squaresoft, but also something like Team Alex, who had made the Lunar series. I mean, it's quite fitting that you have something like Yu Yu Hakusho playing in the background, right? As being indicative of like this type of 90s anime culture. And when I think of like, you were playing Tenchi Muyo earlier, but I think of Lunar, right? Because Lunar, like, it doesn't reinvent the wheel. It just gives you something that's like very classic and has aged well, right? There's also Phantasy Star 4 as being the culmination of the Phantasy Star tetralogy and having like this really epic twist towards the end. And so, when I think I can speak for both of us that when we say, well, Final Fantasy VII is the most influential game, it's not a disservice to these other games. It's just that there was a lot, right? And they're all like incredible, and they're all within their own niche.
Yeah, 100%.
So you would say it's your favorite too?
I think, man, like it's so hard because there's so many games that I love of that era. Like I said, Super Mario RPG is definitely one of my favorites, and it's like that with anime too in the 90s. There's so many anime that I love in the 90s and early 2000s, like Berserk, fucking Yu Yu Hakusho, Cowboy Bebop, fucking Trigun. You look at all of these it's hard to choose, like, because they're all incredible. But I just feel like 7 is such, and I feel like it's dependent, man. I might wake up tomorrow and be like, Super Mario RPG was my favorite, or I might next week be like, it might be Pokemon. Pokemon Red.
I think it's fair, especially once again, if you were to divide the 90s into two separate periods, like 90 to 95 and then 96 to 99 or something, you'd have two really stacked points of time.
Yes.
The last thing I would say is that you were sort of touching upon this are these sort of narrative or mechanical similarities between Final Fantasy 4 and 7 and even Final Fantasy 6 and 7. And I would wonder, especially with these connections between 6 and 7, is someone like Tetsuya Takahashi, who sort of works on 6 with his wife, Soraya Saga, goes up to Hironobu Sakaguchi and is like, let me make my own RPG, please. And as the story goes, Takahashi's desk was blank, right? Sakaguchi says, sure, you can make your own RPG. It'll be sad to lose you on the Final Fantasy team. But the next day, Takahashi has a bunch of robots on his desk. So people were like, you were in the closet. Like you loved robots this entire time. And he goes on to make Xenogears, right?
Yeah.
Because
Which is
I think
another phenomenal game.
I think there are going to be people that will say, well, how do you like Final Fantasy VII when it's just a ripoff of Xenogears, right? Both games have amnesiac character who's going through this type of Freudian and Jungian, psychological journey to find out who they are, right? Both of these games end with questions about fighting God and identity. And
Yeah.
even now Final Fantasy has this whole stupid time loop thing going on. Well, Xenogears was doing all of that. Right.
Yes.
In ways that were a bit more experimental, a bit more strange, especially with Disc 2. So I do want to give a shout out to Xenogears, and I'm sure there are other games that we haven't mentioned, but it's just because once again the 90s is just too stacked.
It's just too stacked, man. Like, and it's something that I feel like our conversations are going to be very long in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and then our conversations I feel like are going to be very short in the 2010s and 2020s. But just because of like the state of the JRPG genre, but I think we're going in a good segue right now into the 2000s, and that time frame. So since you're the historian, give some of the viewers who may not be aware some context to the early 2000s.
Yeah, so you're going to kick off the 2000s with something like Sega's Dreamcast, and this is Sega's last foray into the console market before ultimately failing for a variety of reasons. And I do want to go back a bit and shout out the Sega Saturn, which I've come to slowly appreciate as I looked at its library, and mostly because unfortunately it seems that some of the strongest Sega Saturn games are just not being localized in America. But if you were like a strong otaku in the 90s, the Saturn was such a great console for getting visual novels, for getting role-playing games, for getting mahjong games, for getting all these like weird titles are just never being localized in the US for who knows what reason, right? Maybe they think we don't want to play mahjong and visual novels over here, contrary to popular belief. And so the Dreamcast is going to continue this legacy. You're going to see a lot of games developed on the Saturn get enhanced ports for the Dreamcast. Not too far after that, you're going to get the PlayStation 2, right? Which I don't like. Does it really need an introduction, right? It's the PlayStation 2. It's just the PS1, but doing even more. And now you can watch DVDs on it, right? And this also includes online play. And then two strange consoles, and the discussion for JRPGs is going to be one, Microsoft's Xbox, which off the top of my head, I don't even know. You have like Panzer Dragoon Orta,
Morrowind.
You have Morrowind, but even then, what's going on with the Xbox is more like, hey, those computer games that were only on computers, well, now you can play on consoles. So you know, like Morrowind, like KOTOR, right? And so it's really important for Western role-playing games.
Yes.
And there's some research I'm doing into the perception of the Xbox and Microsoft in Japan, because even though the Xbox may not seem like a big JRPG console, they sort of continue the legacy of Sega, or they try to, in terms of having these type of arcade-based hardcore games. And so there's quite a number of titles. Ninja Gaiden and Dead or Alive are really going to carry that torch for the perception of Xbox in Japan. So if you look at Famitsu back in the day had like 4 different magazines running for each console, and Famitsu Xbox, like each cover is just Dead or Alive or Ninja Gaiden over and over and over again, right? So I don't think there's too much to say in relation between JRPGs and Xbox, although there's like a rich library of Japanese shmups and racing games and other
Yeah.
arcade games. And then for GameCube, you have things like Skies of Arcadia, which uh, it's an enhanced port of the Dreamcast game. You do have PSO. Once
Yes.
again, this is just a port. And then something like Final Fantasy
Crystal
Crystal
Chronicles.
Chronicles. What's really funny, you had mentioned this before of Square like showing tech for Final Fantasy VI and eventually
Hmm.
leaving behind Nintendo. Part of the reason Crystal Chronicles was released for the GameCube is because of this anger that Nintendo held against Square, saying, "Well, you need to develop something for us." And so
Yeah.
Crystal Chronicles was actually produced by Akitoshi Kawazu, and it's one of the few games where you start to see composers who are not Nobuo Uematsu begin to flex their muscles. So I really recommend listening to Crystal Chronicles soundtrack. It's quite beautiful. It's
Hmm.
composed by Kumi Tanioka, I believe is her name, and she had also worked on Final Fantasy 11. So it's not me being dismissive of the GameCube or the Xbox. I think the GameCube was stronger than the Xbox in this regard because you also had Path of Radiance. You had Tales of Symphonia, which is
Yeah.
like massive for the West, right? This is our introduction to Tales of, and unfortunately, Namco sees that and they're like, you know what? We'll only care about Tales of Symphonia from now on, right? They seem to maybe be switching gears these days and trying to remaster and release these other Tales of games. But Symphonia really holds the Tales of series in a stranglehold, I think, in the West. So really, this is going to leave you with the Dreamcast and the PS2, and then an exorbitant amount of independent Dojin games being released for
Hmm.
PC that are just never localized, and I think are going to require like another year of research for me to find out what the biggest ones were because they're there, and I do think they're worth mentioning. They're being developed by like independent developers. Sometimes they're really short, but once again, it's a whole strain. So the big genre elephant in the room is MMORPGs, right?
Yes.
MMOs go back to multi-user dungeons, also known as MUDs. These were text-based online adventure games that were being played on university systems. Eventually, you get something like Neverwinter Nights in the early
Hmm.
90s, being sponsored by AOL, giving you this graphical interface. And then normally people are going to say from there, you go to something like Ultima Online and EverQuest Online, which, yes, you're right. Those are Western games, although I think EverQuest is being distributed by Sony. But I just found out in 1995, Sega released an MMO for the Sega Saturn called Dragon's Dream.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, there's no way to play the game currently. You can get into the debug menu and sort of do one battle, but you needed a Sega modem, and it was a menu-based game with sort of rudimentary 3D graphics similar to the early Fantasy Stars, not Fantasy Star
Hmm.
Online. You would go to a tavern, you would party up with people, and then you'd go out into a dungeon. Unfortunately, I don't know much more than that because both footage and information on the game seems scarce, but it closed after about 2 to 3 years. There's even a more obscure Sega RPG called Dark Eyes, which also seemed to have an online component. And this is the mid 90s. So Japan was entering the MMO market at this point in time, but of course, the juggernauts are going to be coming out of Korea, really South Korea, with something like Ragnarok and
Hmm.
MapleStory much later on.
S-
So
So
the
there's, I don't mean to cut you off, but there's
mm,
also, while you were just talking, I thought of something, and this spawned back to when you were talking about the GameCube, because right when you mentioned it, it popped into my head. And it's also something that we forgot to mention in the 90s, and I'm curious to what your thoughts are, because my first experience wasn't in the 90s, it was actually on the GameCube, and it was
mhm.
Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. So, like, where would you throw the Baldur's Gate games in there? because those are kind of like those aren't necessarily JRPGs, but they have a lot of like strong Dungeons and Dragons. Like it's all kind of like in the same vein. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, for anyone that's played an action dungeon crawler like Gauntlet, I think this is where the genealogy of Dark Alliance lies. It's certainly in this D&D wheelhouse. And related to this, this is when you get the Lord of the Rings game that
Yes,
takes the battle system from Final Fantasy X, right? So this
yes,
is where you start to see Western role-playing games look at what's going on in Japan, and draw upon that. It's the same case for a number of games across East Asia, influencing one another as well.
yeah. It's the 2000s, and I think you're doing a really good job of kind of like explaining how diverse it starts to become in terms of like not only JRPGs, kind of like the role playing genre, because you touched on Xbox, you touched on GameCube, you touched on Dreamcast, you touched on PS2. These were like the preeminent forces in that time, and there was a lot of different JRPGs. I keep saying JRPGs, but I'll default on the word role playing games, where you had like Shenmue, Baldur's Gate.
Right,
Um,
Shenmue having those simulation elements that we had talked about before. So, I think at this point where I would say like Shenmue is not a role-playing game, but it has role-playing
yeah,
elements.
yeah, it does have very strong role playing elements, but that also went on to kind of like spawn the Yakuza series, which is also
Yeah,
kind of like a role playing game. But then now is with the Like a Dragon
yeah,
series is
yeah,
fully
absolutely.
JRPG, which it's the whole genre is very different. The role playing genre is very different, but there's so many similarities between it, and sometimes they start to become like amalgamations of one another. Where just like I mentioned, like the Yakuza series started off as like this beat 'em up game that had that kind of spawned from the Shenmue franchise that was very um, uh, procedurally like kind of like oriented, that something like Quest 3 had when it first came out, like a day and night cycle. You had to like
Yeah,
sleep, you had to eat, all this stuff,
yeah.
and that's what they took from that the Shenmue games, and the Shenmue games were hyper simulation, where it's like you got to be at this place at this time, you have to work this job, you have to sleep, you have to eat, you have to do all of these things. And then that spawned into the Yakuza series, which was like very beat 'em up and had some loose like day and night things, and some of those like you have to eat, you have to make money, you have to do a job, and some of these things. But it was like very loosely based on that. Where now it's almost like the very early it turned into like the very early Final Fantasy games, where it's like there's job systems and there's specific characters that have certain roles, and you could swap between them, and it became very Final Fantasy. You see where like the Shenmue series started and what it kind of morphed into down the line, into a different franchise entirely, and then into a different subgenre within its overarching genre of role playing games. It's just the 2000s were a time where I think that experimentation of like the 80s kind of came back in a way, um,
Yeah,
and
it's an excellent point. I
disseminated itself among like the all of these different franchises that were already established during the 80s and 90s.
There's an interview with the original director of Silent Hill and the original director of Resident Evil, where they're talking about, well, back in the 90s, your development team was 15 people and your budget was, $80, and you can make a really great game out of that, right? And
Yeah.
that's no longer the case. And so the best way to define the early 2000s is that it's the beginning of the end. It's where sort of it really becomes more about, I mean, it's always been about profit. It'd be wrong to say that video
Hmm.
games are never about making
Yeah.
money, but I just think the type of artistic freedom, the sort of like development of double A games, let's say, where you can make like something weird and offbeat, like this generation was the last generation to
Yes.
really get that, and that sort of starts to get scaled back afterwards. I mean, we haven't even mentioned the affordances of portable gaming. So I had teased
Like Golden Sun.
the Wonder Swan before, but yeah, like everything you start getting on the Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Color, you start to see a lot more remakes, right? So Final Fantasy 1 gets remade for the Wonder Swan, Pokemon Fire Red and
Yeah.
Leaf Green, an assortment of Final Fantasy titles for the Game Boy Advance, right? This includes 6, 1 and 2. I think almost all the early ones
Yeah.
get remade
Yeah. Fire
at
red,
that
leaf
point.
green, all that stuff.
Fire
It's
Emblem gets introduced,
hmm
right?
and that spawns a whole nother thing. You had a Fire Emblem Advanced Wars in a way.
Oh,
Like,
right, right. Yeah, yeah. Advance Wars.
there's a lot of like the handheld, like you just touched on it, the handheld market at that time was crazy. Even we got that Super Mario game. What the
The
fuck was the name?
Superstar Saga.
Yeah, Superstar Saga.
Yeah,
Yes.
which like draws upon the battle system from Mario RPG, right?
Yeah.
And having timed hits, right? I mean, we had mentioned Expedition 33. I just want to put a little, I don't know, bookmark here. Yes, I'm aware of Legend of Dragoon. I have not
Yes.
forgotten about it, but once again, the 90s are just so stacked that some titles slip out of your
They
mind. So
fall to the
yeah,
wayside. Yes.
I'm aware of Legend of Dragoon. I've played it. I think it's a good game. I've played Valkyrie Profile, so yeah. For any viewers watching, are like they didn't mention this game.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody is undoubtedly that especially if this podcast episodes gets a lot of traction, there's probably going to be a lot of people that start dropping games that we failed to mention, and it's just a lot of those are definitely going to be in the 90s because the 90s was just such a stacked, like you said, era. It's hard to capture everything that was even in there.
Yeah,
There's
Mega
going to
Man
be ones
Battle
that we
Network,
undoubtedly forget too.
right? The Mega Man Battle Network games being a
Yeah.
great example of like here's a card-based system being implemented into a JRPG that is in fact localized.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember. I remember it very vaguely, but was that Kingdom Hearts game on the Game Boy
Oh yeah,
turn-based?
Chain of Memories. It wasn't turn-based, but also used a card-based
Yes, it was I
system.
thought it was card-based, turn-based, but I remember playing that and like getting the same vibes. But Kingdom Hearts was also another game in the 2000s that kind of spawned its own thing.
Yeah, yeah. And so once again, I don't want people to think I'm a Sony fanboy, but just when you put things in their historical and cultural context, it's the PS2 that walks away
Yes.
as the clear winner here. And once again, you just have a lot of developers who are able to experiment more. So the early 2000s, like up until 2007, um, it's quite similar to the 90s, I think, because even now where I'm like, okay, well, everyone thinks about Final Fantasy X, but Dragon Quest VIII did really well in the US, right?
Yeah.
This was developed by Level 5, who had previously done Dark Cloud, another fantastic game
Yeah.
that was unfortunately marketed as a Zelda killer, even though it was not. I don't think
Yeah.
it's related to Zelda in any way, shape, or form. But DQ8 does really well in the US, right? You have an assortment of other series like what is it called? Shadow Hearts, right?
Shadow
Shadow
Hearts.
Hearts,
Yes.
and its Judgment Ring system. If you want to look at the genealogy of Expedition 33 and its battle system.
Lost Odyssey, very heavily influenced Expedition 33. That's
Lost
another
Odyssey
game.
is 2009?
2007.
2000. Wow.
2007.
2007? That's
then
crazy.
Persona 8 was
Persona 8.
2004.
Where are you living?
Persona 4, sorry, it was 2008.
Persona.
Persona 4.
You just
2008.
revealed yourself as a time traveler.
Persona 8's coming, guys. Be aware, man. It's coming
Yeah.
soon.
Wow, Lost Odyssey is 2007. That's wild.
Yeah,
Yeah,
2007. The World
the-
Ends With You, a game that I never played that I always wanted to. 2007.
another really great DS title. I mean, I guess this is a short segue to 360. Once again, trying to claim this Japanese market and fan base because they do distribute Lost Odyssey. They do distribute Blue Dragon,
Blue
which
Dragon. That was
people
another
like
one.
don't really remember because it's probably on the Xbox, and people remember Lost Odyssey, but it's always just say, why is it still on the Xbox? I think it's backwards compatible. Like
It
you can
is.
play it on the Xbox One. Tri-Ace developed some really stupid game called Infinite Undiscovery for the 360 that no one
Yeah.
remembers.
Yeah, I
But
don't
this
ever
is
remember that game. I know the name, but I never played it.
this is just to say that Microsoft is kind of trying and then not doing that great of a job.
I think this is an issue that kind of pervades Microsoft in general, and even today we're seeing it still, where they do something and it's really good at first, and then it starts to like crumble and they just entirely give up. So like I think they did the right thing by bringing in like all the original people that worked on Final Fantasy, and like the team that did I don't remember the name of that studio that did Lost Odyssey. Um
Mistwalker.
Mistwalker, yes, but that was Sakaguchi, right?
Yeah, yeah, it
That
was
did,
Sakaguchi, yeah.
and it was a bunch of his team. Nobuo Uematsu was involved, all these guys. It was like a bunch of the original Final Fantasy creators that were all involved. And they dropped Blue Dragon, they dropped Lost Odyssey, were fucking phenomenal games. And I think one of the big issues why it failed is because they came out on Xbox. I think if they came out on PlayStation, that might have been, we might have seen kind of a different history or a different turn in the tide, so to speak. But I
Yeah, I
think
mean,
that's an
Miss
issue.
Walker would take up a whole other 3 hours, I think, to talk about
Yes,
like where Miss Walker is and what's going on with them.
I think if those games were released on the PS2 and not the 360, it would have been a completely different outcome. And I think it's more of an issue that pervades the Microsoft brand now, where it's like they release a game and it's a critical success and people love it, and then there's some road bumps, and then they just close the studio or just cut ties with them, like they did
Yeah.
with what was that game that came out with the guitar and you kind of it's like a
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Cyber Bomb Funk Rush, something like
no,
that.
not that one. Fuck, it's like a kid with a guitar and it's like very music based. It was by the guy that did
Not Guitaro, man.
no, it was by the guy that did Evil Within. Um,
Oh, uh,
I can't remember the name, but it was very popular.
guitar Xbox game.
Yeah, it's like a music guitar game that came out not too long ago. Let me look it up. Um,
Yeah, it was driving me wild.
yeah, the name it's escaping me, but
Because Shinji Mikami did Evil Within, right? And that's Resident Evil guy, but guitar game.
um,
Not Hi-Fi Rush.
is it
No, it is
Hi-Fi
Hi-Fi
Rush?
Rush. Yeah,
Yes,
it is
Hi-Fi
Hi-Fi
Rush.
Rush.
Yes,
Yeah,
Hi-Fi
Hi-Fi
Rush.
Rush. Yeah,
That's
yeah,
the
yeah.
game. So Xbox does things where they will bring on studios and the game will be a success like that, just like Lost Odyssey was. Um, and then once there's like a minor hiccup, it's like, okay, we're cutting ties, like that's it. And like the
Yeah.
studio that made Hi-Fi Rush is already closed. So it's like,
Yeah, I think the IP was bought by someone else recently, and
I
they
think
seem
so,
to have
yeah.
been brought back together.
They did it
But
with Sunset Overdrive too, and then
yeah,
Insomniac went to Sony, and that's just, and then they made the Spider-Man games. So it's like it's just a pattern with Xbox where I think they're not as committed as Sony is, and maybe that's
well, the question
this
is Sony even committed? But I think that's
that's
sort of
true. Yeah.
going into the 2010s. So
Yes.
to get into it, no surprise that I would say I think the most influential game of 2000 to 2009 is once again going to be Final Fantasy X, and
Yes.
perhaps in the public conscious Square's swan song. So for those of you
Yes.
that don't know, this game, I mean, Final Fantasy VII is really big because it's the first Final Fantasy title being released for the PS1, so it's debuting all this new hardware and technology. Final Fantasy X is following in the same lineage, and so that opening cutscene is amazing, right? It's the one where
Hmm.
Tidus is playing Blitzball, and Sin begins to destroy Zanarkand. You have that really great metal song that
Yes.
comes on, right? You get goosebumps thinking
Iconic.
about it. A lot of really well-directed cutscenes. I'm not only thinking about the ending of the game when they're saying goodbye on the airship, but also the Unalesca battle where
Yes.
you're preparing to fight against this woman and the screen starts to shake and crack and everyone is giving a speech. I think really a game that's owning in on what it means to be a cinematic RPG,
Hmm.
still being accessible, having this experimental level up system through the sphere grid, being voiced, right? Once again, and
The
demonstrating
first
that
one.
technology. But although it does give you this weird thing because you can name Titus, but because you can name him, no one says his name,
Yeah, I
right?
forgot
And
about that.
so
Yeah.
people are like, is it Titus? Is it Titus? Right? Um, but anyways, so once again, for all these cultural, economic, and historical reasons, it has to be Final Fantasy X. There are other games that are influential in their own right, and those are the games that I would say might be my favorite or might be my runner-up. But I would say it's Final Fantasy X, and I think you're agreeing with that.
I I think, and it's hard. This is like how I feel about Final Fantasy VII. Like Final Fantasy X, and it's so early in that decade too. I think that came out in like 2001 or 2002. It's
Yeah.
so early in that decade, and it feels kind of like an undersell to the rest of the great games that came out in that decade, like Lost Odyssey, Persona, even Final Fantasy IX was 2000 when that came out. Um, Dragon Quest 8, Golden Sun, like all the things we talked about earlier. Kingdom Hearts came out in that time. Like there's a lot of arguments. Paper Mario, there's a lot of arguments that you can have. Mother 3, fuck. Like there's so many. I'm looking at a list right now of all the games that fucking came out. Technically, Final Fantasy 13 was 2009, right?
Oh, that's 2009. I had
Yeah,
that in the tens. Wow.
that's 2009. Like there's a lot of incredible games that came out in the 2000s. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint, but like I think I agree with Final Fantasy X being the most impactful because like you said, it was a swan song because of what happened with the Final Fantasy Spirits Within movie. Just it was
Yeah.
such a and it wound up being the biggest. It was necessary to keep the studio alive, but it wound up almost being like an arrow to the knee, so to speak, for SquareSoft. Like Sakaguchi put, and who was making incredible business decisions up to that time, put all of his money and like all the efforts into Spirits Within, and it just destroyed the studio. This 10-year run that was like unprecedented from like what 1991 all the way till 2001 2002. That run that they had before they merged with Enix was probably the greatest run in video game history for any studio. The amount of games that came out, the quality of every single game that they released during that time frame, the what it did for the gaming industry, the genre, every game that came out, you can argue was the greatest of that generation. So like you could make an argument for like Chrono Trigger being the greatest game of this Super Nintendo generation. You could make an argument for Final Fantasy VII being the greatest game of the PlayStation generation. And you could even make the argument for Final Fantasy X being the greatest game of the PS2 generation. So like that run is unprecedented. There will never be another studio or to do something like that. And it's incredibly sad to see it go out because of a shitty movie, and then they merged with Enix, and it was basically all downhill because they had no
Actually,
leverage.
they did not merge with Enix. As the tale goes, Enix bought Squaresoft,
Yes, yes,
owned the majority because
yeah,
as so for maybe our younger viewers who are not aware, Sakaguchi is living in Hawaii at this point where he plays EverQuest and he goes, "Why don't we have one of these things?" And what he means is an MMORPG, because I had referenced earlier MMOs coming out of Japan, but they weren't overwhelmingly popular. Um, and it's also while he's in Hawaii that Sakaguchi starts to work on Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, which was going to be this cutting edge 3D CGI film made with Hollywood talent, directed by Sakaguchi himself. And so their idea was that they were going to make a virtual cast. So these days, VTubers are quite normal. The idea that you're going to have this virtual character appear in a variety of multimedia. So Hatsune Miku is like probably the biggest example, right? You can play as Hatsune
hmm
Miku in rhythm games. You can play as her in something like Fortnite. Squaresoft was going to do this with Aki Ross. So they spend all their budget making a movie that has aged well in terms of like how it looks. Like it still
yeah,
looks quite good,
yeah.
especially some of the
Visually,
dream sequences. But the screenplay is like not good,
it's terrible. The
unfortunately.
story is absolutely
Yeah,
garbage.
it's just not a great film, and so this was a box office failure.
hmm
Enix begins to look at this, supposed merger, and is like, no, you're going to be absorbed more or less into us, and so they get called Square Enix, right? And the fallout from this, I think, is still being felt to this day because
Definitely.
Sakaguchi is ousted from the company, more or less. Uematsu follows in his wake. There are a lot of other like small restructuring things that happen, but this is what eventually leads to like, oh, we have to make like Dirge of Cerberus, and we have to like
Yeah,
capitalize on the success of Final Fantasy
Advent
VII
Children.
to like start recouping these losses. And then, the same thing is true for something like Kingdom Hearts, which in some ways I would say might be as influential as Final Fantasy X for its
Yeah,
like strange cultural like
yes,
amalgamation of East and West, right? Of like Disney and Final Fantasy. But also someone like Akitoshi Kawazu in 2001 or 2, he releases Unlimited Saga. So by this point in time, Kawazu had been one of the longest working employees at Square, and so he had slowly worked his way up. He basically had fuck you power, and he makes this game that will never ever be made again. He makes an experimental tabletop role-playing game that is like lambasted. So by this point in time, the Saga games were being localized in the US. We got the Final Fantasy Legend 1, 2, and 3. We did not get the Romancing trilogy, but we got Saga Frontier 1 and 2. And if you go back and you read IGN or you read archival reviews of these games, people are saying, why would I play this? I'm just gonna go play Final Fantasy 7. Or they would just outright call the games shit because they're weird, because they're non-linear, they don't have traditional level up systems. So Kawazu makes Unlimited Saga. It loses money. Square's like, stop that. You're going to go in a basement. You're going to become a producer, and you're going to stay there, right? We need to do everything we can to stop bleeding money from Advent Children, or not Advent Children, from Spirits Within. So that wild experimentation of the 90s and early 2000s really comes to an end because of Spirits Within. So that's why I'm calling Final Fantasy X like a swan song. I think Final Fantasy 12 is great. And guess who worked on it as a producer? Akitoshi Kawazu. That's why the game has like these strange level up systems, right? Um, and Final Fantasy 11 is a game I love so much. I think people point towards 9 as being classic Final Fantasy. I think 11 does it, and even more so in its level up
yeah.
system and job structure, and its battle system with its stupid skill chains that are so complex and weird. But what a great, grand, and beautiful world. I have an entire rant I can say on how Final Fantasy 11 is secretly a saga game by way of Legend of Mana. I'll save that for another day. But this is all to say that Spirits Within really causes things to crash down on Squaresoft, now Square Enix.
Yeah, without a doubt. And as a quick side note, I'm gonna shout out somebody here for in a second. Um, Always dead ass. Shout out to one of the boys, Always dead ass. He was a original member of the With the Homies podcast, of what this was originally called, of what the Round One podcast was originally. He was an original cast member, and I was talking to him yesterday, and I let him know that we were going to be doing this podcast today. And I was like, yeah, I'm doing it with a friend of mine that I met through a friend. I gave like a quick history, like we did at the beginning of this episode, and then he asked what your favorite game was, and spoiler alert, I'll cut this out before we get to that point. Your favorite JRPG, and I told him that it was Unlimited Saga, and his exact response was, "All right, yeah, that man isn't human." that was his exact response, was that you are not human.
I'm looking at my imported limited edition version of Unlimited Saga, and it is so beautiful with art by Tomomi Kobayashi, who is as good as Yoshitaka Amano. Fantastic game.
Yeah, it's I I can appreciate it, but if you are a hardcore gamer, if you consider yourself a hardcore gamer, I like shudder to think at how you would feel if you played, and this is for the viewers out there, and how you would feel playing Unlimited Saga if you never played it. I think we could have a separate discussion about Unlimited Saga, because I remember renting that game from my local West Coast Video back in the day when you rented games still, and this is a deeper conversation about like hand holding in games and things like that. And my favorite game of all time is Morrowind, and that also is a very difficult game to just jump right into because it doesn't hold your hand at all, and it has a lot of Dungeons and Dragons elements where like the combat is entirely dice roll oriented. There's no, you have to read what you need to do from a fucking journal entry. There's no
That's
like
sometimes
quest management
wrong.
system. Yeah, and it's sometimes wrong, and there's no
Yeah.
organization to it at all. There's no quest management system. There's like no compass. You have to constantly open up the map. There's it's there's no quest markers. There's no quest management system. It is your weapons break. Like it's a very hardcore game, and somehow Unlimited Saga is almost more hardcore than that, and it doesn't give you any explanation on how to even play the game. So like you basically have to read the game's manual, I remember, to have to like understand how to play the game. You like they don't do any tutorial, they just throw you into it from what I
Yeah.
remember. And I remember
This.
when I rented it, it didn't have a manual in it. And
Oh.
I just played it and I was like, what the fuck is this? What is going on? Like I don't know what is happening. And I just kept dying over and over. I was like, this game sucks. And then I
Yeah.
returned it. And then years later I tried it again and I'm like, this game did a really bad job of like the tutorial system, but if you read the manual, and I did read it at that time, and I was like, the game, once you do that, it's a lot more digestible, and it winds up being like a good experience. I enjoyed it by the end, but I think most people of that generation either didn't read the manual or they didn't have it. Like they rented the game from somewhere and it wasn't a part of your rental. So like Unlimited Saga is like in a weird space, I think in general. But that I feel like we could talk about Unlimited Saga in a completely different uh,
Yeah.
podcast in and of
the
itself.
the two things is that yeah, everything about the game came in the manual, and you can actually access the website through the Wayback Machine now, but it was supposed to have a forum where people would like explain like things to each other, right? Because it's sort of that old, it's not an MMO, but that ethos you saw in old MMOs of like the game's not going to hold your hand. Players will discover things for themselves and then share that amongst one another.
Hmm.
What ends up happening with the Japanese release is that Squaresoft releases like 3 to 4 different books explaining the game, and they're all like really beautiful art books as well. But the game got much more appreciation in Japan, I think, because Square was willing to put in the work, but sales overall just weren't weren't that great. And the last thing I'll say about Unlimited Saga is I have a PhD. I am a doctor, right? I spent 5 to 6 years getting a PhD. I think learning to play Unlimited Saga was harder than completing a PhD. I had to watch several hour-long videos explaining how to do like blacksmithing in Unlimited Saga, how to level up your characters. I had several forum pages bookmarked. It gave me such an intense headache. And then once I got into it, there was no going back.
I will agree with you on that. When I played it as a kid, I was like, this game fucking sucks. I have no idea what's happening. I hate this. And I returned it. And then I played it like in the early 2010s, maybe. I replayed it again through 100% legal means. And I grew like a slight appreciation for it. I still think my initial experience kind of like ruined the game in a sense for me. And I wish I didn't have that initial experience. And I think I would view the game more fondly. But I played it again in like the early 2010s, like maybe 2011, 2012. And I watched videos on YouTube that existed at the time. And I read a bunch of stuff from the manual online and found these websites that kind of taught me how to do the basic mechanics of the game. And I was like, okay. And then by the end of it, I was like, yeah, this was actually a good game. And I think the biggest fault of it was not properly doing like a integrating like a tutorial system in like a organic way, where they kind of just were like, yeah, you just got to do this and like learn, which is
Yeah.
kind of like I appreciate it in a sense because that's how life is. Nobody gives you a fucking tutorial on how to like fucking live your life or live life in general. So I kind of appreciate that in a way where they were just like, art imitates life, like figure it out.
Yeah.
But
They've been remastering all the Saga games, and the only game left to remaster
I
is
don't,
Unlimited Saga.
I,
So the question is, how much of it are they going to change, or what? And
I
I'm
don't,
very excited to see what they do.
I don't know if they're even going to do that. I feel like that's such a hard game to.
They did like everything. Like the original Saga trilogy is on Steam now.
Yeah, it's
the
on
romancing
Switch too.
trilogy and minstrel song, they're on modern consoles now. The Frontier duology, I mean, Frontier 2 got cut content restored, right? This is kind of jumping ahead, but I think one of the things that marks the 2010s and 20s, let's say more so the 20s, is the restoration of like old
Yes.
JRPGs getting remastered. Like Lunar just got
Yeah.
remastered this year, right? And Square has certainly been outsourcing work, so the Mana series has been getting remastered, the Saga series.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think the most influential games of the 2000s would be either Final Fantasy X or Kingdom Hearts. Those would be my answers. As far as my favorite game, I'll surprise you. It's not Unlimited Saga.
Really?
And the reason why is because there was a game release on the PS1 past the point that the PS1 was like over.
Yeah.
And I mentioned it before. It's called Gun Parade March. It was released in December of 2000. This game was never localized. There are like 3 English reviews of it online. I want more people to experience this game, but unfortunately, there is a very, very strong language barrier. I had found this game by just reading different video game forums, and someone had referenced it, and then I just dug deeper and got my hands on it. Um, it was developed by Studio Alpha, which actually Western players might be familiar with because they had made a game called Elemental Gearbolt for the PS1.
Oh yeah.
On rails shooting game that is really, really expensive these days. The Western copy can go for upwards of $200
Kind of like Sin
plus.
and Punishment from what I remember, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And they also had another series called Castle Shikigami, which got localized with like a really stupid cover. So it's an anime game, but the Western cover is basically Charlie's Angels.
Mhm.
And so they didn't really have that big of a reputation in the West for RPGs, but in Japan they had developed a game called Linda Cubed, which just got a fan translation. I highly recommend checking that out. And they did another JRPG called Over My Dead Body, where you're basically playing through generations of family members as they die and age in order to defeat this evil. But like aging is part of the game's mechanics, so it's quite different
Like Sifu.
compared to something like Romancing Saga 2. Yeah, a bit like Sifu, right? But these games are never localized, and it's the same thing for Gun Parade March. Gun Parade March and Elemental Gearbolt take place in the same multiverse. This is the lead writer, Yuri Shibamura. He has this whole thing called the Seven Worlds Saga. And so when you boot up Gun Parade March, you basically learn that there are 7 like dimensions, including ours.
Mhm.
And so you're playing as yourself, controlling a character in the game in order to defeat this evil. And basically, what this game is that it's predating something like Persona by several years. But it's a sandbox simulation game where you're attending school, you're partaking in battles, but all the AI, all the NPCs, all have their own schedules and they're all doing their own things. And they react dynamically towards your actions and towards each other.
Mhm.
And so when you start the game, you can only play as one character, and you're most likely going to befriend or romance one of the main girls. Her name is Mai, except
Mhm.
everyone hates her guts, but she's also the strongest character in the game. So you're going
Mhm.
to befriend her, and as you get closer to her, you'll probably get stronger in battle, but people will stop talking to you. People will stop being your friend. People will become wary of you, right? And to this date, I have not played a game that has that type of advanced AI sandbox simulation style game. And the battle system looks like a tactical game, but it's not. You do your actions by choosing, all your actions are represented by letters, and you have something like, let's say, 10 slots. So kick is K, right? And then jump is J. And so you basically pick all these actions to make words, and then everyone will take their actions at the same time. I don't even know how to explain it. It's insane. And if the last letter of an action is the first letter of the next action, it takes up less letters.
Huh.
So let's say you have double kick, which is like DK, and then you have triple jump, which is KJ. That'll just be DKJ instead of DKKJ. And so there are ways to like take all these insane actions in battle that really feel like you're piloting this mecha fighting these interdimensional monsters, or you're
Mhm.
jumping across a battlefield with 2 swords, slashing left and right. throwing off your sword to take out your gun. Your gun's out of ammo, so that you're unleashing like 50 different missiles into a radius around you. It's one of the
Hmm.
greatest games of all time, and it's totally incomprehensible, more so than Unlimited Saga.
Hmm. Yeah, I've never heard of that. I'm gonna have to try and play that or find it somewhere. Um,
Yeah, acquiring copies is really easy because the game is only $15, but once again,
the
because it's
localization.
because it's part visual novel, there's a lot of text to work through.
Yeah. It's so the 2000s is a very like we were kind of alluding to before. It's a very long era. There's a lot of like different moments in it. It encompasses like really two major like consoles, two of the most important console generations ever, which was like the SNES. You get the tail end of the SNES, and you get the PlayStation 1 and the PlayStation 2 kind of within that same era. Um, but I really think it's you said this. I think it has to be the most influential game is Final Fantasy X, just for everything that it did and everything that it contributed to the it was like a swan song. It was like a final goodbye from SquareSoft. And I feel like I never really gave my favorite. But I feel like, and like I did the same thing with Final Fantasy VII. I feel like it's hard to really say what my favorite is because there was just so many games and there's so many different time frames. Like I might wake up and be like Final Fantasy IX was my favorite of the 2000s, or I might say Final
Yeah.
Fantasy X was my favorite of the 2000s, or maybe it was Lost Odyssey. Lost Odyssey is fucking incredible. Um, Maybe it was Mother 3, which was also one of my fucking favorite games ever. Maybe it was original Paper Mario or Xenosaga, which is something that we also
Oh
did not
yeah,
really
yeah,
talk
yeah,
about.
yeah,
The
yeah, yeah,
Xenosaga
yeah.
games. Um, there's so many games that also feels like the tail end of like the steroid era where you seen like a bunch of pitchers that were kind of doing steroids too. Like you had like fucking Roger Clemens and fucking you could make the argument whether Randy Johnson or not was on steroids, but um I'm trying to think of the other guy that was fucking juiced out of his mind. There was a lot of like in that tail end of the steroid era, you had a lot of pitchers using it as well, and that's what it feels like in this era. Like you had a lot of heavy hitters that kind of were all over the place in terms of like the consoles that were on the you had some that were on the Game Boy Advance, you had some that were on the GameCube, you had some that were on at the tail end of the Super Nintendo, you had some that were on the PS1, some that were in the early era of the PS2, and then some that were in the late era of the PS2, like Final Fantasy 13 was 2009. I mean that was in the PS3, right? Final
Yeah,
Fantasy 13. So you had the
yeah.
very early era of the PS3. You had Kingdom Hearts. You had Kingdom Hearts 2, which some people consider like one of the best JRPGs ever. Um, Wild Arms,
Oh yeah.
Enchanted Arms, Eternal Sonata, and then you have games like fucking and I thought about this when you said you've never seen a game that really judges you based on the people that you like your party members and stuff. And I feel like when something clicked in my head when you said that, and it was, I think that was something that was in um Knights of the Old Republic and Mass Effect. I think also had that.
Yeah.
Um,
Things that we associate with Western role-playing
yes,
games,
which
right?
are
Where
Western role player games.
if you
Yeah,
if you have like Morrigan in your party and you do something good, she's like ill.
yeah,
And so then I quick load my file so I can
yeah,
be good and then put Morrigan back in my party.
yeah. It's there was so many and like Mass Effect. I don't even remember what year that came out. I'm about to look that up right now. Let me
I
see.
think it's '07.
Yeah, I think it was '07 or '08. And that's '07. So there's a time frame in the late 2000s as well where it seemed like the Japanese like kind of historical dominance from like the Squaresoft era, the Super Nintendo, the PlayStation 1 was kind of tapering off and you had a lot of crazy American um video games kind of coming out like Gears of War,
Yeah, yeah. This is
Half-Life.
this is a really great point because the influences of Final Fantasy 13 are all these titles that you're mentioning. So you know what? I'm not going to shout out Microsoft because they don't need my shout outs, but the games that are being produced for Xbox at this point, the Western RPGs um, come to dominate the landscape.
Yeah.
As you're saying that your Morrowind, your Mass Effect, so on and so forth, and Modern Warfare 2. And these are
Yeah.
all the games that the development team for Final Fantasy 13 says, yeah, we looked at them and we wanted to make that, but for Final Fantasy, which is why, like, look at some of the level design between Modern Warfare 2 and Final Fantasy 13 in terms of having corridors, having these basically linear hallways with battles that you're going to do, right? Because 13 doesn't have random battles. You can see the enemies on screen
Yeah.
and either avoid them or fight them as you wish. That's a really good point. Yeah, like here's the ascendancy of like Western action games and RPGs.
Yeah, that's what I feel like kind of happened during that era. It's like it's hard to say too because there were some ones sprinkled in towards the end of the 2000s that were really great still, some really great JRPGs, but the late 2000s and especially the early 2010s was an era that was kind of dominated by a lot of Western RPGs and just Western games in general. And I'm trying to think
Skyrim
of
right around the corner, right?
yeah, that was early
2011.
2010s. That was 2012. Like that was the beginning of that time frame where like historically like the Japanese market kind of dominated the video game industry, and we've seen a quick shift where the American industry kind of started to take over and the Japanese industry kind of to fall out in a sense. And I guess that might be a good segue into like the 2010s, even though like we're not going to be talking about like the western side of things in the 2010s really, but I think it's a good
Yeah,
segue to start talking about the
I
2010s.
think one thing I would want to look into more is looking at the 2010 games that are not being localized in the West. Although I think localization starts to get better, especially when we start to mention like fan translations, right?
Yes.
And making games more widely accessible. But with the death of Sega, and sort of the clamp down on these type of more experimental games, you're not really going to see like Sakura Wars 3 and 4, which once again are really great games for the 90s leading into the 2000s. And yeah, I know Sega eventually localizes Sakura Wars 5 or something for the PS2, which is a game that no one cares for. And then they develop a new one for the PS4 that no one also cares for, right? But once again, that experimentation that you saw in the 90s and 2000s is just gone.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to mention is Final Fantasy 11 is keeping the lights on for Square. It's their highest grossing game for a very long time, up until 14. I think really gets rebooted and starts to do quite well. So I think that's a really great segue into the 2010s. Hey, Squaresoft like was a financial failure in the early 2000s. Well, they were also a financial failure in the
Yeah.
2010s. And obviously not total financial failure because Dragon Quest is still selling a lot of copies, and
Mhm.
so are a bunch of other Square Enix games,
So
including Kingdom Hearts.
to mention that and to kind of talk about the merger. So, well, that wasn't a merger; it was an acquisition. So, to me, I remember when this first happened, this merger. It in my head, I thought it was a merger at the time, and then I started to notice all of like the Square properties started to really be dog shit and like were terrible, and all of the Enix properties were getting like original Enix properties were getting like a lot of love, and I'm like, man, I was like, what's happening here? And that's when I like later discovered that it was a full on like acquisition. And it almost felt like Enix was like getting revenge of some sort for like what Squaresoft, like their dominance in a way. Um and that whole like late 2000s, mid late 2000s and on, and I think even now today is just the fall of Squaresoft still happening in real time, and Enix still kind of exacting some type of revenge on like how dominant Square was during that 10-11 year run that they had. And because in my opinion we never got another good Squaresoft game, like Squaresoft property, that was either remade or was continued like the Final Fantasy series. In my opinion, I don't think we ever got another good one after 10. And I don't really count 14 or 11 because those are like completely different games in my opinion.
No. I'm a strong, staunch defender of this. Listen,
I think those are good games. So
they're good games, but I don't think they should be dismissed because they're online games. Because I used to think that way, and then I played. I mean, I was a long time player of 14, and I've sort of cooled down on it now. But this is interesting because then you could say, well, 12 is not one because it's an Evilus game, right?
I hate
It should have
12. I
been
hated it.
a spinoff. Well, 13 is not one because, and then you start making all like these like arbitrary restrictions for being
That's
like, oh,
true, yeah.
this isn't a mainline Final Fantasy game, right? And I sent you that image that was going around after Lost Odyssey was released, where people took the cover of Lost Odyssey and then they slapped the Final Fantasy
Yeah.
13 logo onto it.
Yeah, it felt like a Final Fantasy game like that. That was, and it's funny because we had all of these other Final Fantasy games come out in that time frame. Like I hated 12, and I still do with a passion
I love 12. That's what I
because
said.
it. After growing up playing, like we talked at the beginning of this podcast, the first Final Fantasy I played was 2 in America. I went from playing that all the way up until 10, and then when I played 12, it was such a jarring, like,
Yeah.
like unique experience that was unlike any other Final Fantasy before. I was like, "What the fuck is this?" It felt like such a terrible game and such a
Mhm.
deviation from what I was used to and what I knew, and I just hated every aspect of it. And I
Absolutely.
remember
I can totally agree with that.
a friend of
Or
mine
understand that.
trying to convince me. He had it and he was like, "Yo, you got to play it. It's mad good." And we used to talk about Final Fantasy all the time. And he was like, "Yo, you got to play it. It's mad good. You got to play it." And then he lent it to me and I played the game for maybe 2 hours and was like, "I hate this game. I'm giving it back to you. I hate it.
Yeah.
I hate it. The voice acting was terrible in my opinion.
Mhm.
The gameplay was terrible. It was nothing like any Final Fantasy I played before. I played the game for literally 2 hours and was like, "I can't play this game. I hate it. Everything
I
in my
understand.
core hates it."
And I think you're not the only one, which is
Yeah.
why people this is why people ignore 11 because they're like it's an MMO, it's not real. But I think even if 11 were a single player game and more accessible, it would still be alien and strange to people because
Yes.
it doesn't play like traditional Final Fantasy. Once again, I think it has more in common with Saga. And why people really start to say after 10, like this is the end. As far as like who's who once the actual acquisition weird
Yeah.
merger thing goes through. This is interesting because I think you would have to really own in on specific people and like some their quarterly reports are available, right?
Yeah.
So this goes back to me mentioning, well, I wonder what Japanese games weren't being localized and how well they were doing because when when we say something like Squaresoft, if you go look at what the actual like sub development teams were, they were called like Square Business Development 1, Square Business Development 2, 3, 4, 5, and so
Yeah.
on, right? So these were all the separate teams that are like technically not technically, they are part of Squaresoft, but they're like in their own cliques.
Yeah.
And you talk to any fan of Kingdom Hearts, and they'll tell you, "Oh, I really hate Kingdom Hearts games made by the team from Osaka, right?"
Yeah.
Because they think like I know the Osaka team did something like Birth by Sleep. I don't
Mhm.
remember the other ones they did, but like people don't like the design philosophy of Square Enix's Osaka team, right? Um, and so I once again, it'd be interesting to look at their quarterly reports and look at the specific people to see what IPs they're working on and who's consistent between the Enix IPs and the Square IPs.
Yeah, I'm very interested to know that too, but it's wasn't like when this whole merger happened, basically like a lot of the people that were involved and like the big wigs that were kind of in charge of each kind of division were basically all left the company because I remember watching an interview. There was actually one recently too that happened. It was between Sakaguchi and Nobuo Uematsu on like Nobuo's podcast because he has a podcast, and I was watching somebody's like translation of it, and they kind of talk about how once Nobuo said himself, once Sakaguchi left, Square died, like it was over. Like
Yeah.
no matter what people think it is today, Square Enix, they look at it, they call it a merger, they call it an acquisition, whatever it is. In Nobuo's mind, Square died when Sakaguchi left, and all of the people that were kind of surrounding him and all of like the people that he had in charge in his clique of each like little subdivision all left too, or got relegated into some other type of role or responsibility once Sakaguchi left and they were acquired by Enix, and that kind of changed the entire scope of what was basically acquired. Where like they almost acquired like uh a like shell of what was. And I'm sorry, my AirPods just died, so I'm putting in a wired headphone so I can hear you. But it kind of changed the whole, I guess, trajectory of that acquisition in a sense. Because all of the important key people had felt like either left or they were being misused, and it showed, I think, in the games that they were producing.
Yeah, Tetsuya Takahashi, right? He leaves alongside Saga and then goes on to make Xenosaga. Unfortunately, also runs into production and financial trouble. It was supposed to be 6 games, ends up only becoming a trilogy. And I think it's really only when he starts to work alongside Nintendo that he's able to get the proper funds and time needed to make those games. And this sort of wraps around back to like, is Zelda an RPG? Because people really like Breath of the Wild open world
Oh
system.
yeah.
People really like the ecology of that game, right? Like watching monsters and nature and the cycle goes by. Um, and I've tried to look into this, but Monolith Soft helped Nintendo develop Breath of the Wild, and they helped
Hmm.
them develop Tears of the Kingdom. But as far as public statements I have seen, it allegedly Monolith Soft has only helped with quote unquote the topology of the map.
Hmm.
So I don't know any more specifics of that. But if you play something like Xenoblade Chronicles, especially Xenoblade Chronicles X, and then you play Breath of the Wild, you're like, wait a second.
Yeah, it has a similar like exploration system.
Yeah. So with the 2010s, like yeah, it's the start of this brain drain. Final Fantasy 14 is released to critical and financial failure. And this is also where you get the ascendancy of Yoshi P, especially in Square Enix, right? And becoming one of these public figureheads, similar to Sakaguchi.
Hmm.
This is the PS3 and 360 era. Not much to say about the 360 besides that it becomes Sakaguchi's temporary refuge alongside Mistwalker. So we mentioned Lost Odyssey, Blue Dragon. You do get the Nintendo Wii, and I do think it's worth mentioning Project Rainfall because
Mm.
people really wanted 3 specific JRPGs to be localized. Xenoblade Chronicles, the Last Story, which is a game developed by
Yeah.
Mistwalker and not talked about as Final Fantasy like 13, even though I think it does it predate Lost Odyssey? No way,
Um.
no way, no, it can't. It comes out after Lost Odyssey. It has to.
What last story? What was?
Last Story.
Yeah. Let me see. That came out. I remember
Yeah,
always.
2011.
Yeah, 2011.
Yeah. But it doesn't get talked about as like Final Fantasy 13 or quote unquote 14.
Yeah.
But it's Xenoblade Chronicles, The Last Story, and Pandora's Tower, which is like the least talked about games out of this like loose trilogy. But there's a big push by a Western fan base to localize these games, and all 3 of them end up getting localized. Like, wow, look at that, right?
Hmm.
Um, I think the game I really want to own in here is Xenoblade because we had mentioned while Western games were embracing this type of open world structure that was becoming more popular, and Xenoblade really runs along with that in having an open world environment and leaving the opening town and seeing a level 99 monster or level 70 gorilla or whatever it is, and it can kill you,
Yeah.
right? So you have that sense of freedom and exploration, which up until then was really absent in JRPGs. It's a defining feature of romancing saga, right? But that's the exception to the rule.
Yeah. It's the 2010s is also a very like weird space as well. Um, just because it feels almost like the 2000s in a way too. Like we had major jumps in technology from like the early 2000s even to like the mid 2010s, and it spawns like 3 different console generations as well. You have the PS2, PS3, and PS4 eras in that time frame as well as like the original Xbox, Xbox 360, and Xbox One. So like that also spans 3 different console generations. But the traditional like JRPG genre was very like small at that time, it feels like, and it kind of fell, and this was like what something we were talking about earlier, is it kind of fell out of um the like frame of like influence, so to speak. Like it Japanese games and JRPG specifically weren't really considered. They were considered like old and basic and boring, and the way of like the American game kind of took place, where it's like action, adventure, uh, gore, um, guns, Call of Duty, Gears of War,
Yeah.
Half-Life, like all these other types of games kind of took hold. Battlefield, like everything was very rugged and like action based and super high energy. So like people were like, turn based, that shit is boring. I don't want to play that. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. And Xenoblade does not have turn-based combat.
yeah. And
Um,
it's so like I can't even really pinpoint exactly what, like I think I know what I think the most influential game would be, but it could really be a lot, because there isn't really a de facto, I feel like there isn't a de facto game like in the 90s and 2000s that you can really point to.
Yeah, it does become a free-for-all. I think experimentation is much more rare. There are some strange games. So Tri-Ace, who we haven't mentioned before, but they were getting their games published by Squaresoft, and they make Valkyrie Profile, which is a really
Hmm.
fantastic game that marries turn-based combat with fighting game systems. So if you ever played Namco's Project Cross Zone, which is somewhat similar to Super Robot Wars. Um, but they make this game Resonance of Fate, which is like this steampunk gun action game with a really incomprehensible battle system. Um, but back in the day, there might have been like 4 Resonance of Fates, right? But this time you're only going to get that one game that people are like, oh yeah, that was a game back
Hmm.
then, right? You do have some heavy hitters, and you do have, I think, the ascendancy of um, I'm not going to say smaller companies, but IPs that were being dwarfed by Final Fantasy. So Shin Megami Tensei 4 comes out and does really well, right? So
Yes.
we haven't been talking about portable gaming much, but when I talk about MMOs, I think Monster Hunter does deserve a
Yes.
shout out. So Monster Hunter 1 and 2 are not localized, but the PSP versions are localized, and they're emphasizing this type of networked play. You have Pokemon Black and White 2, Dragon Quest 9,
Hmm.
which also has this type of create your own character similar to Diablo and whatnot. But then I think the big games early on is that you have Xenoblade,
Hmm.
Chronicles, and then Persona 5
Yes.
and
That
and
that was
and
my game.
and Dark Souls. And I think it's really Persona 5 and Dark Souls that take it and run away. Like, yes, The Legend of Heroes is not massive at this point, but
Hmm.
slowly getting bigger and bigger, especially as we approach like the year 2010, and more games are getting localized, and people start to really build into this 40 game narrative, right?
Hmm.
But I remember like first off, Shin Megami Tensei was already niche, right?
Yeah.
Persona was already niche. And then Persona 3 comes out and is does a bit better, right? Only because it's combining these dating sim elements with, RPG systems. But Persona 3 and 4 are still like not that popular.
I think Persona 4 was the one that was like the shift. I would liken like a Persona
Yeah.
4 to like a Final Fantasy 6. And then
Yeah, that's a
and then
good, like,
Persona
yes,
5
yes.
was like 7.
Yeah. Yeah, because I don't think Persona 4 is like the game that breaks it open, but Atlas definitely starts to milk Persona
Yeah.
4. You're like, let's make a dancing game. Let's make a spin-off. Let's make Persona 4 Golden. Let's
Yeah.
port it to Steam. And I think it's the port to Steam that does really well, that convinces Atlas to and also they get bought out by Sega to start bringing their games to PC. But
Hmm.
I remember when Persona 5 was released and going to Anime NYC, because like Anime
Yeah.
NYC had like just been
Started, yeah.
invented. Yeah, just started. And like seeing so much Persona 5
Oh
merch, I'm
yeah, it was
like,
everywhere.
it being a good barometer, like Anime NYC being a good barometer for like what's popular. It's like when Chainsaw Man came out and like Anime NYC had its thing, like everything was Chainsaw Man, right?
Yes.
But I'm like, what the hell is this? People are into Persona 5 now, right?
Yeah.
Just like a massive, massive juggernaut.
Yeah, it was. That's why I think like there was a lot of great games of the 2010s. But I think the preeminent force of the 2010s, like when I was making this list, was like it has to be like Persona 5. There was other games and like even like subsections. Like you're right, Dark Souls was insane, and like that has a lot of like JRPG elements. But if I had to really look at like specifically traditional turn-based JRPGs, like it's no question Persona 5. And like there was other games that came out. Like look, we had the fucking Final Fantasy 7 remake come out and that game fucking sucked. Like we could have another like conversation about that too. Like eh, when you have probably the most impactful game in the genre ever made get remade and come out, and Persona 5 is still more impactful and important than that, that kind of like says something. It says something about Persona 5, but then it also says something about the remake of fucking Final Fantasy 7 just being absolute dog shit.
Yeah, like I said, I think there are some sleeper hits in the tens, but I
Yeah.
just you can even hear it in my voice. I just don't feel as excited as
Yeah.
animated. I don't even like the PS3 UI that
Yeah,
much,
me
although
either. I hated the PS3.
a friend of mine likes it. You know, there's just this might be like a generational thing, right? Of
Yes.
like, oh, for you, you think old good, new bad. Look, no, I think there are some really fantastic games in the
Near
2010s.
Automata, some of the
Yeah,
Fire Emblem games, um,
but I
Octopath Traveler,
Octopath Traveler is being
Nino Kuni.
representative of this. I don't like Nino Kuni.
Oh, really?
I don't. I think Nino Kuni is. I beat it. And I think it's incredibly boring.
I
I
can see
don't
that.
think
Yeah, I
it's
can see that.
charming at
It's a
all.
very just it's like if Studio Ghibli made a video game, but like it wasn't nearly as good as Studio Ghibli.
And this is interesting because Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind, is such a fantastic movie, and from what I read, influenced Final Fantasy. So you can kind of
Hmm.
see this obverse
Yeah.
relationship, right? Um, I would have to sit down and think like, what game channels Studio Ghibli? What RPG channels Studio Ghibli the best? Because I know they worked on Ni no Kuni, but I'm sorry, it's not Ni no Kuni. It's just not. It'd probably be some weird game that's not an RPG. I already thought of one. I'll tell it to you later.
Yeah, I don't
Because
really
I'm getting
know.
off track. But
Maybe Moon?
um no, no, because the voice acting in Moon is too disorienting.
I never
I think
played
it's
Moon, so I'm going based off of like what I
people
think. Earthbound?
people don't talk in Moon. It's all like remixed, recorded voice footage. So it's imagine if like you chopped and screwed dialogue from a soap opera.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
gotta play that game. I
and
gotta play
people
that game.
like everyone speaks a different language. Like you talk to one person and it sounds like chopped and screwed Spanish. You talk to another person, it's chopped and screwed Japanese. Like everyone talks in this really weird. It does some really interesting things with voice language.
Hmm.
But once again, I'm getting off topic. So
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, I don't
I
want to
I
deviate.
I I really think it's either Persona 5 or Dark Souls. I think Persona 5 just has such a big fan base. I mean, people make jokes that Persona 5 invented jazz music, right?
What?
Yeah, because people really like the OST of Persona 5. It's such a stylish game. And Dark Souls is interesting because upon release, like, okay, let's look at the way it was marketed. It did well enough for Bandai Namco to turn this into like a trilogy of games. It did well enough that when Bandai Namco ported it to PC, they called it Prepare to Die Edition.
Hmm.
And I think this subtitle is so interesting because it points towards the fact that they are aware the game is difficult, and they want people to play it because of that. And so, unfortunately, Dark Souls gets straddled with this reputation as being the hard game. Where I
Hmm.
think what makes Dark Souls interesting is not the fact that it's hard, but the exploration, right?
Yeah.
I don't care for the combat of Dark Souls. For me, it's secondary to like
Yeah.
what it's drawing upon from Kingsfield and being a dungeon crawler,
That's
right?
how
And
I felt about Elden Ring.
I'll have some thoughts with regards towards Elden Ring later on, but what ends up happening is that when Dark Souls 2 is released, you look at some of the design decisions. So, for example, you'll enter a room and there'll be like four gigantic knights all swinging their hammers who like won't stop. Like they have infinite stamina gauges, and it just feels hard for the
Yeah.
sake of being hard. And
Yes.
I've put like hundreds of hours into Dark Souls 2 across PS3, across Steam. I'm not one of those people who thinks it's a like sleeper masterpiece, like an underrated masterpiece. But I do think it was the last chance that From Software had to try to do something different because the game had a new game plus mode that like some bosses had like extra mobs with them.
Mm,
You have a spider boss that attacks you in an area where it didn't before. That the later Souls games, for some reasons, they never incorporate. So this is why with Dark Souls 3, it's really a greatest hits album. It's like, remember this? Remember Anne
yeah.
Orlando? Like that's here. Remember Gwyn? Well, his theme is back here. And with Bloodborne, I like Bloodborne. I think it's fantastic. But I prefer the role-playing elements of Dark Souls because Bloodborne, all the fashion looks the same to me, and you can't really do a magic build, right? Every time I
Yeah.
play Bloodborne, I just feel I'm more or less playing the same character. But you also have Nier Automata, which is also really huge and coming out of seemingly nowhere, right? Think back. This goes to Drakengard. I think 4 people bought Drakengard,
Mm,
including me. And I only bought it because it said Square Enix on the box, right?
yeah.
Did I know this game had branching paths when I played it as like a 10-year-old? No, I just beat the game once and thought, oh, that's it. This game is really strange and weird. And then you go back as an adult and you're like, oh, this has like a rhythm game as its secret final boss. Oh, this was developed by the producers of Ace Combat 3. You know, it has these strange origins. Nier is really popular on like forums and online, but doesn't have that big of a crowd. I would describe Nier as like one of the best 6 out of 10 games you need to play, right?
Yeah.
It's so flawed, it's so clunky, but I still think, as you said earlier on, like it's this flawed masterpiece. And then Nier Automata comes out,
Yeah.
and right, everyone loves it. So what ends up happening is almost like you were talking about the revenge of Enix against Square. I would say the revenge of like these sibling JRPGs against Final Fantasy.
Yes.
Like, all right, sit down, Unk. It's our turn
Yeah.
now,
Yeah. That's definitely
right?
what that felt like in the
All these
2010s.
games, all these games that were more niche now start to get really, really big followings. So I know Persona 5 is huge. I know Nier Automata is huge, but curse Dark Souls because it invents this stupid Souls-like genre where every game has a roll button now, and it's called a Souls-like.
Yeah.
It has to be Dark Souls. And if you're someone that at this point in time you're like, no, I'm only talking about the most pure RPGs, then sure, if Persona 5, but I see Persona 5's influence more on the community and fan base than I do on game design.
I I agree with you 100%, and I am not a like my pick was Persona 5, but I think I agree with you a little more, but I think if we're trying to judge it directly in like the JRPG genre as we know it, like the traditional sense, I would pick
Right.
Persona 5, but I think with your argument you definitely convinced me that it's Dark Souls, and I am historically until Elden Ring, I was a Dark Souls hater. I had Dark
Yeah.
Souls on the 360 when it came out on the 360. I played it and I never beat it. I was like, this game fucking sucks. It's not difficult, and I grew up playing difficult games. I used to speedrun the original Ninja Gaiden, which is like known for being a fucking historically difficult game, and I am not opposed to playing difficult games at all. But when I played, and you kind of touched on this, and it resonated with me, that it was just a game that was difficult for the sake of being difficult, and I think that's not how I would like historically judge like a difficult game. I just
I
think the
think that's
game.
Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls, I mean Dark Souls 1 has its flaws, but it
Yeah.
was really with Dark Souls 2.
But that's how I felt about the Dark Souls series, because I played Dark
Mm,
Souls 1 and I think I played Dark Souls 2, and I was like, these games suck. Like, I don't
right.
like them. They're just difficult to be difficult. And like, I hated the community because they had this like very
Oh yeah. Yeah,
arrogant
yeah,
like
yeah.
outlook on
Get
video
good.
games. And it's like, yeah, it's skill issue, get good. And it's like,
Yeah.
no, it's
Yeah.
just a shit game
Yeah.
because it's just hard to be hard. And like, it puts you at a handicap. And it's like, that's not a good game. It's not a difficult game where it's difficult because of the mechanics that you have to master or whatever. It just puts you at an inherent disadvantage that isn't necessarily based on skill. And it can becomes something skill based. And it definitely does require a skill to execute some of these things at a really high level, but in its purest form, it is not a difficult game in my opinion, and it just felt like a a very arrogant group of people kind of co-opted the game, and it kind of like ruined the experience for a lot of people until Elden Ring came out for me at least.
Yeah,
Um,
which is so funny because, like I said, you can't say Dark Souls 1 was not a financial success because it
yeah,
leads to Dark Souls 2. And for many people, that was their Elden Ring back in the
yeah,
day. And I think it's very rare for a series to keep releasing a new game and to keep having like, oh, this is a game that attracts a wider fan base. But then Elden Ring came out and like, wow, it really blew the lid
yeah,
off things.
yeah, 100%. Like I think, and I didn't share what my favorite game is yet of the
Yeah, neither have
2010s.
I. Yeah.
But I think you definitely hit the nail on the head, and it's hard to say which one. I think there's two answers, like a traditional JRPG most influential game, which is Persona 5, and then a like in a basic sense JRPG. If you're looking at a basic definition, it's Dark Souls without a doubt because of what it did. And even now we're having lasting effects where there's so many Souls-like games.
Yeah, this
And
game, it's Wu Chang and then
yeah,
some
Wukong, Wu
subtitle.
Chang, like
Yeah,
everything is Souls-like or has some Souls element, and then the Souls kind of even roguelike games kind of uh become like a Souls. They're like synonymous now. Roguelike games and Souls games are synonymous. Um, but to put a I guess a pin on the 2010s, my favorite game wouldn't necessarily be either of them. And it also wouldn't necessarily be a game that is in the, I guess, it's in the JRPG genre, but it's not either of those games or something that people would probably consider a JRPG traditionally. And for me, it's either a coin flip between Yakuza 0 or Yakuza Like a Dragon. And those are also different games within themselves. Um,
I thought you were gonna say Undertale.
Undertale is also up there. I love Undertale, and I love Deltarune. They're both great games. Undertale is a phenomenal game and definitely wildly impactful. And if you're looking at it from like an indie perspective, Undertale is there's nobody even close. It's Undertale and then everybody else below them. Um, it's kind of like you look at like Michael Jordan or like Tom Brady. It's those guys and then
Yeah,
everyone
because
below them.
I think if we're including Undertale, then I would say Undertale more maybe. Damn, that's a hard one. Is Undertale more influential than Dark Souls?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It is very hard to say. They're both very close.
Because the two things we haven't mentioned here is that one, with the 2010s, I mean, you've touched briefly upon it, but you have a backlash towards Japanese culture and products. So Phil Fish, who had developed Fez at GDC, I forget which year, but it's like a really famous scandal.
Yeah,
He gets asked a question by Makoto Goto, who was a developer at Square Enix, had worked on the graphics for Final Fantasy 13. And Goto asks Phil Fish, "What do you think of Japanese games?" And Fish says, "They suck. It used to be the kings, and now it's over. Like they're not good." And around the same time, Keiji Inafune, who had been ousted from Capcom, this is the
hmm,
creator of Mega Man, around 2013, he also says, "Oh, I think like the era of Japanese games is over." So there's like this public perception of like Japan's dominance
yeah.
within games, and we can extend that to role-playing games as being over. And so alongside that, you have the rise of Western role-playing games that are advertising themselves as JRPGs.
Yeah.
Most famously, I think it's Ubisoft Montreal who develops Child of Light,
Yeah.
and they call it a JRPG, right? And so I think Undertale is a really great example of a game that's not developed by Japanese developers, but has taken and
Oh yeah.
admitted to the influence of it, right? I had mentioned before that Toby Fox drew influence from a game like Moon, and certainly a game like Earthbound. And Undertale's reputation like cannot be
Yeah, it
understated.
can't.
And I For me, I would say I count Undertale as a JRPG only because I think this term is nebulous.
Yeah,
Like,
it is.
why is a JRPG different from a WRPG? And if you tell me because they're linear and whatnot, then I can name you JRPGs that are not linear, and I can name you JRPG games that are more
Yeah,
experimental and use card games or use online components or
yeah.
do X, Y, and Z things. So you know what? I take back my answer from Dark Souls. I I'm gonna give it to Undertale. I'm gonna give it to
Okay.
Undertale. I'm gonna give it to Undertale for most influential JRPG.
I I can agree with that. I think because of what it did for indie games and even like the beginning of the JRPG resurgence. And it's funny because my pick for the 2020s so far is another game that is not a JRPG but draws a lot of influences, but still within that nebula.
Yeah,
But it I definitely think it is Undertale without a doubt. Um, now that like we really sit and break it down and how much it kind of like impacted the genre and the resurgence. Um, and I was debating on putting that as my personal favorite, but when I think about like the story of Yakuza 0 and like how we drew
yeah,
back to like the early um the 2000s when we started talking about like Shenmue and how it's almost like a spiritual successor to those games, and like this has been now a franchise that existed since the PS2, and if you really want to call Shenmue the original, since the Dreamcast, and now it hits like an insane peak with
yeah,
Yakuza 0,
yeah.
and
Everyone is singing Bakamitai, right?
yeah,
Everyone.
it hits an insane peak with Yakuza 0, and then Like a Dragon is like the same time frame, kind of. And I love Like a Dragon because it captures so much of what JRPGs were, and it draws so many influences from like the traditional like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasies, like the original ones that we played in like the late 80s and early 90s. So it's like a strong homage for me, but also incorporating a lot of like what made the Yakuza 0 game so fucking good. So like that would probably be my favorite, and it was very hard. It was like a coin flip for me between those two games and Undertale. Because then Undertale has some other games that kind of spawn from it, like Lisa the Painful. I don't know if you played
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like Lisa is like another fucking phenomenal game that wouldn't have happened, I feel like, without Undertale. Um, and that kind of went on to like Undertale kind of went on to spawn its own subgenre of like JRPG indie JRPGs, and it is definitely this also
Well,
feels like a hard era to kind of pinpoint exactly what
I was wondering this. So Lisa predates Undertale by a year,
does
but
it.
I feel that yeah, Lisa, because I remember seeing people talk about Lisa the Painful, but I felt that as what you're saying is that Undertale helped put a spotlight on these type of like RPG maker
Yeah,
games.
yeah, I think that's what it did.
Because
I
this was
thought it predate.
definitely
I thought it was after
no, because
Undertale.
I remember being like a freshman in college, and seeing people talk about this game. But it seems like these type of games, even though they predate Undertale, so there's also an upcoming remake of a French RPG maker game called Off, all
Mm,
capital letters OFF. This is another game that predates Undertale, but after the remaster was announced, I think you definitely have a bigger crowd for it because of Undertale.
yeah, definitely. And I think Undertale's music and Toby Fox is just insane. Like I said this to you like a couple weeks ago. I think the if I could make like a super team of like composers to make a game, Toby Fox would be one of them. It would be like Nobuo Uematsu, Toby Fox, um, Kevin Penkin,
Yeah.
um, uh, I forgot what her name is. She did the Final Fantasy. I mean, she did a Super Mario RPG.
Yoko Shimomura
Yes, Shimomura. And then
and Street Fighter 2.
yes, yes,
What a stacked discography.
yeah, 100%. And I might even throw in a DKC. I can't remember his name. Um, David something. What the fuck is his name? The guy who did DKC, but like if I
Yeah,
had to get 5 people together in a room and make a video game soundtrack together, it would be those people.
yeah.
But that's a separate conversation. But I think, yeah, I think those are my favorite, and I think those are the ones that I would pinpoint as the preeminent games of the 2010s.
Yeah, so to recap, once again, you have all these niche series like Yakuza, like Nier, like I mean, the Legend of series doesn't grow to the same extent as these other franchises
Yeah,
do, but still grows, right? Persona 5 certainly, and then something like Dark Souls.
yeah.
My favorite game of the 2010s is I really love Dark Souls. I've
Hmm.
poured hundreds of hours into Dark Souls 1. And for me, it came down between Dark Souls 1 and Saga Scarlet Grace Ambitions. Uh,
Hmm.
and uh, for people that don't know, Saga Scarlet Grace was sort of the grand return for Saga after having been gone for quite a long time, although that's not quite true because it was an internet web browser-based game release that sort of kept
Hmm.
the series afloat. Um, Kawazu didn't direct this game, but he did produce it. It has really strong art direction, once again by Kobayashi. It has a really kick-ass soundtrack, and it really changes the battle system. I think both Saga Scarlet Grace and its younger sibling Emerald Beyond have the greatest battle systems in Japanese role-playing games.
Hmm.
They're not turn-based; they take place on a timeline where the move that you pick moves you up and down on the timeline.
Hmm.
And if you're next to an ally, you do like a combined attack. If an enemy is all by himself, he'll do a unison attack. So you really have to be careful like how you're on your timeline and what skills you're using, and like status effects actually matter. It's semi-open world, it's non-linear. Uh, because it doesn't have that much of a budget, the open world is not like, let's say Expedition 33 or something like that, but that's fine enough for me. I fill in the gaps with my imagination. Once again, I just really love the role-playing elements of Saga and the agency that you get. And I haven't really listed a Saga game here as like being my favorite of the decade.
Hmm.
So I'm gonna give it to Saga Scarlet Grace, although it could easily be Dark Souls 1 as well.
Okay. So I guess that leaves us with the cherry on top,
The
the
last 5 years.
the last 5 years. Yeah. And I feel like it's very easy to say one game. And I think Elden Ring is, I know you have your thoughts on it, but I feel like that is the most impactful game of maybe the past 5 years in terms of like JRPGs. There's another one that just came out um that is probably going to win game of the year. Um but I don't know if it's going to be as impactful as Elden Ring all around, but I think you could make the argument that it will be just as impactful for the traditional JRPG genre.
Yeah, as far as influential goes, it hands down, it just has to be Elden Ring. I mean, at this point, everyone knows what Elden Ring is. Like my non-gaming friends, my non-gaming
Hmm.
acquaintances, A24 is producing an Elden Ring movie, right?
Yeah.
I think it's even being directed by Alex Garland, who did Ex Machina, Annihilation, and some other titles, right? So, not necessarily like a Denis Villeneuve who had been directing Dune, but still someone reputable in their own right. And A24 having that like reach beyond a gaming audience.
Yeah.
What's interesting about Elden Ring is that, we're talking about what happens with the 2010s is that you sort of have like this complete erasure of like, oh, oh, you're from Canada? You can't make a JRPG. Well,
Yeah.
you can, right?
Yeah.
And th there was an interview last year with Yoshi P, who's a producer of Final Fantasy 14. Um, who he said, because he was also the producer of Final Fantasy 16. He said he hates this term JRPG. He doesn't know
Hmm.
where this term came from. He feels that this term puts developers in like this genre.
Pigeonholes them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why I'm such a staunch defender of like these really weird and strange JRPGs that I've mentioned
Yeah.
before. And so with Elden Ring, I mean, one of the things that I don't really see people talk about is that this game's story was written by George R. R. Martin,
Hmm.
right? And so Miyazaki has talked about the influence of something like Michael Moorcock's the Forever Champion, right? This
Hmm.
is the Elric series for people that have never read this. I highly recommend going back. This is swords and sorcery fiction from the 60s and 70s. It's called the Eternal Champion. It's about Elric and his demonic sword. So if you look at things like Arthas, right, as the Lich King, if you look at the design of Geralt, all these things are being
Hmm.
traced back to Elric. And also Miyazaki mentioned RuneQuest, which was a TTRPG release, something of a competitor to D&D. So you had D&D, you had Traveler, and you had RuneQuest. But one of the things
Yeah.
that RuneQuest did was that it emphasized storytelling through character creation. And I will say that I'm an Elden Ring hater. I'm an Elden Ring's number one hater, right? And I love From Software, but I think it would be disingenuous to say I don't understand why people like this game. I completely understand why people like this game. I see all the merits with it. I understand why people think this is the greatest game of all time, right? It's just not for me. I had a good run with From Software. We're breaking up. I'm sorry, it's not you. Well, it is you, but it's also me, right? But I'm saying all this to say that in Elden Ring, I can get on my horse, I can have my lightning spear, and I can have the grandest adventure role-playing experience of a lifetime, right? So I understand why people like it, and I see the influence between Western fantasy literature and these previous design
Hmm.
philosophy of From Software, but it's just not for me.
So I was somebody, like I said before, that hated the From Software games,
Yeah.
but I don't know what it was about Elden Ring that just grabbed me immediately. I think the thing with Elden Ring that really got me is there's no story in that game. I feel like there's no fucking story. So like anyone that says like it has a wildly compelling story, it's bullshit.
Sure.
It's the and maybe there is a story there. There's probably a lot of lore. There's probably a lot of really interesting things about the world, but it is the exposition is like non-existent. There's no um real big like lore dumps. The game is very much focused on gameplay, the mechanics, and the world. And that was the thing that really grabbed me was the world. Yeah, I and this is something from like Morrowind that very much and even the Red Dead
Mm,
Redemption 2 that really grabs me as well is when the world feels like lived in and there's things happening that you that aren't necessary that if you weren't there they would still be happening. And those are the type of games that really grab me and that was something about Elden Ring. I remember getting on the horse and riding around and just avoiding enemies and shit and just looking at everything that was going on. And I remember it just started pouring out of nowhere. And I was like walking on the horse. I wasn't running at this point. And then all of a sudden I hear some weird singing. And I'm like, what the fuck is that? What's going on? And I follow like the voice, and it's just this weird harpy sitting on the edge of a cliff, staring out into like the ocean, just singing.
yeah.
And I'm like, and then I go up to it, and it's not even attacking me. And I'm like, yo, what is this thing?
Yeah.
And then I start attacking it, and then it kills me in one hit. And I'm like, yo, okay, like this, there's just so much about that game's world that really grabbed me. And I think that was the thing that I loved about it the most. And like there's something that's very interesting about Elden Ring, and it kind of intersects with Breath of the Wild and like Tears of the Kingdom, where it almost feels like um Elden Ring is like the mature and like hardcore version of those games. And like I wasn't a huge fan of Breath of the Wild either. And like I was
Hmm.
talking about this the other day on my stream because I was playing Link to the Past and I think my favorite Zelda games are the top-down like open worldy Zelda, Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, um uh the original Zelda. Those are some of my favorite Zelda games, but I don't like
Mm.
Ocarina of Time. I love Twilight Princess, which is weird, but I don't like Ocarina of Time. I don't like Majora's Mask. I don't like Wind Waker really. I don't like Breath of the Wild like that. But there's a lot of similarities between like Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring that I noticed like after replaying Breath of the Wild a little bit. But I don't know what it is about Elden Ring that just, I guess maybe they figured out a good way of like implementing like challenge with like exploration and like world building and immersion all in one that made it so insanely good. But
Yeah.
like I went back and I played some older Dark Souls games and I didn't like them. Like I don't know, maybe I'll have to give more. I didn't try
Yeah.
Bloodborne. I didn't try like I played a little bit of Sekiro. I didn't really give it enough of a try to really make
Yeah,
an
I
opinion
don't
on it.
it's weird that I understand why Sekiro gets brought up in relation to Souls games, but there's one boss that's like, okay, this was like a leftover asset from Dark Souls 3, and you guys threw this in here.
Mm,
For people that have played Sekiro, it's the demon of hate. But that
mm,
boss does not belong in the game at all, and it shows in just how badly I think that fight is. Um, but this is interesting to hear your viewpoint of as someone that likes Elden Ring, went backwards, and doesn't like that games because it's sort of the reverse of my relationship, right? I get to Elden Ring now, I'm like, it's good enough for me. And for people wondering how far I got into Elden Ring, my first playthrough was a soul level 1 playthrough, and I got up to the Fire Giant. And then I lost all motivation and I just put the game down. I just wasn't enjoying
mm.
it anymore.
I think I honestly think the game opens up after the Fire Giant. The game opens up a lot more after Fire
Isn't
Giant.
that more or less like the end of the game?
Yes, but the game opens up a lot more towards the end.
I don't want more opening up. I want closed spaces.
Well, I think some of the best stuff in the game happens after the Fire Giant fight.
Sure, I believe it. I mean,
Um,
because this all started with my friends being like, "Oh, the waterfowl boss. What's your name? Melania?"
oh yes,
They
Melania,
were
yeah,
like,
Melania, whatever.
and I don't care. I don't care. And I think I started to see the writing on the wall with the final boss of the Dark Souls 3 DLC, the Ring City. And the set piece is really cool. You touch this egg, and then you're like teleported to the end of time. Like the
Mm.
whole level is in ruins and shambles, and you're in the middle of a desert. And
That's similar to Elden Ring.
there's an NPC that you've encountered throughout the series of DLC that you fight in like the middle of this desert, and then like he transforms into like this monstrous knight, and like lightning is raining down, and he's flying around
Sounds
the
like the Radon
sky.
fight.
It's quite similar. So, when I was telling you I don't like Elden Ring, part of it was like, hey, all these things that are new for a lot of Elden Ring players, they've already been done before,
Yeah,
right? So Elden Ring is not Elden Ring. Elden Ring is Dark Souls 72, right?
yeah.
And so it's like, oh, another swamp level. Here we go again. Another fire level. Oh, more recycled bosses, move sets. And I don't want to sit here and harp on Elden Ring because it could be a discussion for a whole other thing. And once
Yeah.
again, no one needs to convince me why Elden Ring is good because I completely understand that. And I think it would be disingenuous to say Elden Ring is a bad game. I may sound critical, but there are bad games and there are games I'm just not a fan of.
Yeah.
Elden Ring is a game I'm not a fan of, but it is not a bad game. And I had a lot of fun in my playthrough before I stopped. But once again, it's just not for me. But basically, what was happening is that as the Soul series became bigger and bigger, it emphasized these action elements, but more so from boss design rather than player design. So
Mm,
in something like Elden Ring 2, you are not going to be Dante from Devil May Cry, right? But the
yeah.
bosses might be the boss. I mean, look at something like Waterfowl Dance, right? Where the boss is doing like 50 different moves at once. And I just don't care for that. I don't care for the fact that every boss has 2 health bars. Dark Souls 1 has this boss called Ornstein and Smo. It is legendary because it's a 2-on-1 boss fight halfway through the game. And when you defeat one of them, the other absorbs him and becomes stronger. And it's such a hype moment. So when I'm playing Elden Ring and it's another boss with 2 health health bars, two different forms. Well, Dark Souls 3 already like did that so many times that it wore itself out. I just didn't care for it.
Yeah, I can see why somebody like I don't really know much about the Elden Ring. I mean the From Software like lineage because I wasn't like a big From Software guy.
Yeah.
Um, but from what I hear and what I know about the games, what I hear about people saying, what I know, it does seem like Elden Ring is an amalgamation of everything that the first three games and Bloodborne ever did, like put all together in like an open world.
Yeah,
So there
yeah,
it is a lot
that's
of
pretty
like
much it. Yeah.
it is very derivative and it is very
Yeah.
like while it's kind of portrayed as like a standalone is separate from the Dark Souls series, it almost feels like a Dark Souls like 5 or whatever. What is there, Dark Souls 4 or does that exist?
Dark Souls 4 doesn't exist. So,
So
it would like be Dark Souls
it
4,
feels like a
right?
Dark Souls 4 then, where it's like this is Dark Souls, but it's not the same name.
And as I had mentioned, this goes even farther back to something like Kingsfield, which I think has seen greater appreciation now because Dark Souls has been quite popular. So people have gone back and they've played Kingsfield, they've played Shadow Tower, and they've even played Armored Core. They're like, oh, From Software made this whole other mecha series. But one of the criticisms I've seen of Armored Core 6 is that a lot of the freedom present in previous Armored Core games are gone, and now it just feels more like Armored Core with Souls combat.
Yeah, I grew up playing Armored Core on PlayStation 1, but I have not played an Armored Core since then. I think what was the first two on PlayStation 1 and then 3 was on PS2.
I know the first two were at least on
Yeah,
PS1.
I remember playing the first Armored Core 1 and 2 and I loved those games. And I had no idea that From Software made those until after Elden Ring. And I was like
Yeah,
looking
from
up their other games and I was like, wait a minute, they made
Yeah,
Armored
From
Core. I used to
Software
love
like
that game.
released so much jank and so many interesting 6 out of 10 games, such as Evergrace. Go listen to the soundtrack of Evergrace. Your ears are gonna bleed. You're gonna be like, I've never listened to anything like this before. And a lot of those games were in fact localized. But the same way that Final Fantasy came to overshadow Square's back catalog, that's what's happened with Dark Souls and From Software. And
Yeah.
to an extent, I do understand that Miyazaki came in and like he really helped out on development of Demon Souls, but this is a company that's been around for decades beforehand, and I do think it's a bit of a disservice to like, yes, a lot of their success is coming from Dark Souls, but they had a whole rich history before Miyazaki came in and
Yeah.
before Demon Souls was in development.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. I feel like we've kind of deviated and very much focused on the From Software and Dark Souls games. Um,
Well, I think it just goes to show that,
the
listen,
impact.
I do admit its impact and like talking about how because this company is not new, but in the public perception, it's new,
Yeah.
and so it's quite wild that as a quote unquote new company, it's been so strong right off the bat.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Like, and I guess it also just speaks to the impact of Elden Ring and how like influential it's been so far in these past 3 years since it came out. But in the 2020s decade so far, even though it's only halfway over. Um,
Yeah, I mean
so
the other title you mentioned, Expedition 33, right?
yeah, Expedition 33 is the other game that I would say is the most influential, and it's kind of something similar to what we were talking about in the previous generation, where you had Persona 5, which was like the preeminent traditional JRPG game, and then you had Dark Souls, which was like the modern JRPG game. And I feel like that's the same case here. It's like where you could make the argument for the outright JRPG most impactful game of the 2020s so far being Elden Ring, but now you had a traditional game kind of come along that has been so impactful so far, and the game has only been out for like 2 months.
Yeah,
Uh,
they just finished visiting Square Enix and Kojima Productions in Japan.
yeah, it's insane that this game has garnered so much like acclaim in the past 2 months, and it's kind of thrown the whole traditional JRPG genre and like industry on its head. Where like, and I think I was saying this last, like when we were at the wedding, was the JRPGs were kind of looked at as like there was a standard, and the standard was originally in like the 80s, and this kind of like culminates this whole conversation is the standard of every generation, where like the 80s was Dragon Quest, then the 90s was Final Fantasy and Squaresoft was the standard. And then the 2000s was almost still kind of Squaresoft, and then and Final Fantasy, and then the 2010s was Persona, where if you're looking at traditional turn-based games, the 2010s is Persona, Undertale, some of those games. And then now the standard has become Expedition 33 is now the standard, and every JRPG that comes after this will be viewed as the standard, where it's like we're comparing you to this. You aren't going to be compared to these other JRPGs that are coming out now. You're going to be compared to Expedition 33 until the next huge industry changing standard setting game comes out.
Yeah, and I think Expedition 33, I mean, its production is in this weird space, the way it gets talked about, because from what I understand, the employees are former Ubisoft developers, who all had various degrees of experience at Ubisoft, and some people are conspiratorial, and they're like, oh, actually they have like the backing of like this other billion-dollar French company. Listen, I don't care whether or not Expedition 33 is a AAA game, a single A game, a quadruple A game.
It's a pseudo AAA game, whatever
right,
you want to do.
It's certainly not like it's certainly not an independent game in the same way that something like Chained Echoes or Sea of Stars is, but I do want to put it in this lineage because I think it has maybe like a bigger budget, right? And certainly a passion, especially with the director talking about being influenced from Final Fantasy VIII. Like he's a real sicko for that. Shout out to him, because I think 8 has like a really bonkers story that I appreciate, but a lot about it doesn't work.
I've heard that the inspiration is very also very like reliant on Final Fantasy X, and I think that is the close it is so much like Final Fantasy X in like all the best ways. The combat is very similar. It's almost like a combination of 10 and like Lost Odyssey and like Super Mario RPG all had a baby. And then you have the way you traverse the world is very similar to Final Fantasy X.
It's so PS1 coded.
The story
it's so PS1 coded.
is very much like Final Fantasy X.
End of Act 1, here's your end of Disc 1.
Yeah, there's a lot to the game that it does really well, and it draws a lot of inspiration from all these great JRPGs throughout history. And I think the major, like you were mentioning, that everybody was kind of like, oh, it's not a indie game, it's not a small studio, they have this backing from this company and all this money, and the developers were all in AAA studios, so it's not fair to call it that. None of that shit matters. The thing that matters is that this game was clearly made by people who were very passionate and very driven and didn't seem like they had constraints where like money was necessarily an issue, and you had all of these stakeholders and various people that had no knowledge of JRPGs or video games kind of making decisions, because that's typically how things start to become, is you have these stakeholders that have no experience or history or knowledge of any of these things and what it takes to be good, or necessarily have the same passion for these products, that are just in it for money. And their money may or may not be leveraged in a sense too. And they're making decisions, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It seemed like the people making the game had were making the decisions, and also money necessarily wasn't a problem. And that's what made this game so good, and that's what made the experience so good for a lot of these players, because the passion behind it, the team behind it, the vision and the purpose was on full display. And that's something that you don't really get in video games today. And I think that's like the argument that people were making is like, oh, it's a AAA, it's all AAA developers, there's all this money behind it. It's like, that may have been the case, but it wasn't handled like any of these other studios that have the same like constructs. It wasn't handled in the same way at all. And that goes to show you that that's what matters most, is having the right people in the right place with the passion and vision and purpose, where they're all on the same page and everyone's united, and there's not these people pulling like the strings behind the scenes or whatever, or trying to leverage whatever influence they have, or have to appease to certain people, or it's that game is like a representation of everything that needs to happen in the video game industry. I think that's more so what the importance of, where the importance of it lies, in a sense, is Expedition 33 is kind of like a manifestation of everything that needs to happen, while also being a symbol of everything that was great in the previous generations of video games.
Yeah, I think interesting about this is I agree with you in that I think it's a great game. I don't think it's a masterpiece because I think it's flawed in the same way that PS1 games are flawed.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm at the end of the game, time to break the balance apart.
Yeah.
Right? So, you're thinking of something like Final Fantasy VII and getting Knights of the Round Table or getting Omni Slash or any of the million ways you can break these PS1 games. The same is true for Expedition 33. It's still fun to get to that point, but there's something that's lost there. But I agree with you. I would rather have this than something like Final Fantasy 16.
Oh yeah, Final Fantasy 16, in my opinion, is absolutely terrible. I think this is also a wake-up call for the JRPG industry, and I think Square Enix is going to be taking note. And I think this is a very, very pivotal moment for Square Enix, because if Square Enix fumbles whatever Final Fantasy 17, whatever they decide to do after 16, if they fumble, this is do or die for them. This is like the original Final Fantasy moment for Squaresoft, where like if they fumble this, it's over for them, because everyone's seen what Final Fantasy is supposed to be. Where I already seen photos of like people photoshopping Final Fantasy 17 as Square Enix, like they did with Lost Odyssey, where now this feels like it could be the nail in the coffin for Square Enix.
I do wonder because on the one hand, Square is so important for the JRPG industry, but I also want to think beyond Square. So if Square were to go belly up tomorrow, I would move on with my life.
Yeah.
Right. And I think Expedition 33 is a good game, but it's also still banking on a certain type of familiarity and nostalgia, right? And I've told you this before. I don't care for having Final Fantasy 1, but with good graphics.
Yeah.
Right?
Me too.
Because I think with or without Expedition 33, JRPGs will continue to be developed. There are still a lot of JRPGs that haven't been localized here that are doing things that
and Nintendo's doing a great job of localizing a lot of games that never came over, which is something we touched on very briefly at the beginning of this. But like, the Switch has become like a retro JRPG machine, where they're just turning out like all of these games that were never localized, and they're just bringing them over Live Alive.
Like Live Alive and remastering the Romancing series, which weren't initially released, and then you have the full-on remake of Romancing Saga 2, known as Revenge of the Seven. So I do want to admit the importance, or the seemingly importance, of Expedition 33, but I think the industry doesn't need Expedition 33 to survive or do something, just because there are too many subgenres and like weird things going on, right? So the big subgenre that we haven't mentioned here is mobile gaming, right? Which so tabletop games, let's say, were killed off by video games, and then injured by card games, and then video games were like dominated by MMOs, and then mobile games sort of killed MMOs, right? So it's sort of like a video killed the radio star type of relationship.
Definitely.
Because now with the death of like actual portable systems, because I don't think the Nintendo Switch is portable in the same way that the DS or the Game Boy SP was, only because these previous portable consoles were a way for developers to like funnel like a little bit of funds to make like these strange type of games that wouldn't fit on a home console.
Yeah.
Right. But now that's gone. And so
portability is also different as well, where like there's a certain feeling, like the same way with a flip phone, where you flip it closed and put it in your pocket. I was carrying my fucking Game Boy SP, Game Boy Advance in my pocket as a kid. You
Yeah, you're
can't
not
do
going to
that with
put
a
your
Switch.
Switch or Steam Deck. You're going
Yeah.
to have like your charger and
A carrying case, a book bag.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
can't just throw it with your wallet in your pocket and then pull it out
A
on the
whole
bus or
thing.
whatever.
Yeah. And so games that would have first, as you're pointing out, it's a financial issue, right? So now it's much more difficult to have double A development. But games that would have been developed previously for these mobile consoles are now just being turned into like mobile phone games. So look at something like Wizardry, what starts off as a Western role-playing game. The IP eventually gets bought up by a Japanese company, and they develop a whole series of home console games. There's even a Wizardry MMO that died. And now the newest Wizardry game is called Wizardry Variants Daphne, and it's a gacha game, right? And it's the same thing for something like I think it's called Dragon's Nest, which is one of the first mobile gacha games, and then later on you get Fate Grand Order, and like people may be thinking, I've never heard of these games. They don't matter. I'm sorry. Fate Grand Order is making like billions of dollars for
Oh,
its
yeah.
company. Like it can't be ignored. And especially after something like Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail and Zenless Zone Zero, like people
Yeah.
know what these games are. This isn't like some, oh, I'm not, these don't count as real games. They're real games. They make a lot of money. They're influencing
Yeah.
things. Like Xenoblade Chronicles 2 had gacha mechanics for some weird reason, even if it was a single player game,
Yeah.
right? Um, so I'm also thinking of like Labyrinth of Galeria, which is this old school dungeon crawler game released. And there's a couple of indie JRPGs that are still being released. There was a indie RPG game festival called Bit Summit that just happened recently that is worth checking out. So once again, I do want to like, yes, Expedition 33, I think we're going to look back on it and say this was a moment in time, but I think the industry will survive without it.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think the industry is contingent upon it because, like you said, it's so like there's so many subgenres and it's reliant on so many things. But
Yeah,
I think in a traditional sense, the industry needed this because it's kind of like a wake up call of what people
right,
want. And it's a wake up call of like what is more important. Is it story? Is it exposition? Is it
right.
gameplay? What is it? Because everything that when the standard was originally Final Fantasy, and that standard has kind of just dissolved into nothing. Where the story
Yeah,
isn't
no,
great,
I totally
the
understand. Yeah,
gameplay is terrible, the the exposition, like everything is bad about it now. And I think this game came along and everyone's like, oh shit, this is what it was. This is what it was like. This is what it's supposed to be. And I think this is less of less of an indictment of the JRPG industry and more of a direct indictment of Square Enix. And I think that's why I think Square Enix may not survive. But I
yeah.
think
I
in a
think
conventional
you don't
sense.
think that. Oh yeah, okay. I was gonna
In a
say you don't think
conventional
Dragon Quest
sense.
will keep making them like
Yes,
millions of
yes.
dollars?
I think they will start to go even more into their niche, and eventually Final Fantasy may turn into something else. But I think the games that they're successful with will go even deeper into that. And then the games that they're less successful with will either start to disappear, will get less, even less releases of them, and there'll be more every 5 years or whatever, every 6 years one will come out.
Yeah, I wondered. It'd be interesting to see what ends up happening
I'm
5 years
very curious to see
from now.
how the impact of Expedition 33, what it has on Square Enix. But I also think we'll wind up seeing, kind of like with Undertale, a lot more, and I'm hopeful that we do. We'll see, because it also happened with Dark Souls, where we're getting all of these Souls-like games. I'm hoping we get these Expedition 33-like games, where some other studio comes out and they're like, oh, here's our like JRPG or French RPG, and we drop a game that's like Expedition 33, and it's a whole unique world with a great storyline and great exposition and great gameplay and unique mechanics, and we start getting good traditional JRPGs again instead of like these bastardized versions of them that we've been getting for the past decade with like a sprinkling of good ones here and there.
I don't know. I might be a fan of Bastardized because I think Strangers of Paradise, and I think that game rules.
Yeah, I never played that one.
That game, unfortunately, I mean, its marketing. I mean, its marketing kind of helped it, but most people remember it for like this is a remake of Final Fantasy One where you play as the bad guy who listens to Limp Bizkit, and in some ways, like yeah, but the game rules, and it takes a lot of the systems from Neo, which is, I mean, it's like Dark Souls, but not really, right?
Mm,
Um, and I think Strangers of Paradise actually has like a pretty moving story.
yeah,
Like,
I'm gonna have to try that.
I mean, watch a trailer where, they're playing Frank Sinatra's My Way, and you're like, wow, this game is so beautiful. And then you boot up the game, and the main character is like, I'm here to kick ass and chew bubblegum, and I'm all out of bubblegum, right?
Yeah.
And it just has that energy roaring through it.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree with you. I think the bastardization is also good at times,
Yeah,
but
but I understand, your thoughts and people saying, please, just give me a classic game.
yeah,
Just give me a classic.
I think there needs to be a clearer like direction, or like Final Fantasy was so good because Sakaguchi, and he was kind of like the ringleader, and he was able to rein all of these guys in and like create the best work out of them while
I
also being
do.
able to like appease
Okay.
whatever stakeholders were
This
involved.
is the last time I'll push back on this, but I've been looking at Yoshinori Kitase, who emerged as a director.
Mm,
I think with Final Fantasy 6, 7, and then eventually was a producer on 10. And 'cause I did a lot of research on Final Fantasy 13. I'm writing a whole thing on it. And he's frequently showing up in interviews for Final Fantasy 13. And these days with Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth, and of course, there's also Tetsuya Nomura, and the director of the Seven Rebirth and remake. But then I was wondering, like, well, how big was Sakaguchi's role by the time Kitase was sort of having his hands involved in these projects, and Sakaguchi was given more a managerial position,
mm,
right? So I'm not saying you're wrong, but there's something I'm
mm,
kicking around in my head because once again, I'd like to go in and like see
mm.
what is Sakaguchi's stance on Final Fantasy 7 and 8 and these other titles? Because I know he did have a more direct approach in 9, because 9 was supposed to be like the
Yeah.
classic return, right?
Yeah, I think when they were talking about it on the interview with Nobuo and him did recently, and they were kind of referencing how he was almost like the ringleader of everybody, and he
Yeah.
was able to kind of like rein everybody in, and he said, I think his direct quote was that it felt like a college like club, like it felt like
Mm,
it was like a video game club where everyone was super passionate, but everybody like kind of gravitated towards Sakaguchi, and he was the guy that like instilled this trust in everybody and belief, and like was inspiring everybody and getting the best work out of everybody. And then when he was gone, everybody's like, yeah, like I don't know
yeah.
how to feel about this anymore. And like
Yeah.
I'm not trying to give all the onus to him,
Yeah.
like, but I think what we need is more people like that in the industry that are passionate and finding the best, most passionate people for each project, and allowing them the space to kind of work and produce these great games, and being able to balance like the creative aspect with like the business aspect, because I think that's what um, Sakaguchi was incredible at until the spirits within, you know,
Yeah.
you know
This is
you
something
can't be 100% at all times, except his mistake was the biggest of ever in that company's existence.
this is something I wrestle with of like, well, what does the fan base and audience want? Like, if you want a turn-based game, you have plenty of other
Yeah,
turn-based RPGs out there. If you want Sakaguchi, well, he kept making games, and he
yeah.
just came out with an improvement of a mobile game he made
Fantasian,
called,
right?
yeah,
Fantasian.
Fantasian, which was distributed by Square Enix. It seems partially thanks to Yoshi P, who's a big fan of Sakaguchi. I mean, Sakaguchi plays Final Fantasy 14. You can see him
Mm,
running around the world if you play on JP servers. But like, yeah, Sakaguchi is still making games. So like, what's going on here? But I think I've ranted enough about, I don't know, anti-Sakaguchi. I'm not anti-Sakaguchi, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. You're not trying to give this guy all the flowers because there's a lot of other important people that were
Yeah,
involved,
yeah,
and
exactly,
it feels
exactly,
like Sakaguchi
exactly.
definitely gets like a lot of the respect when there was a lot more important
Right,
people involved than just
right. It's
him,
yes,
which I
exactly.
agree with
Yes.
100%.
Yeah, right. And like I love Uematsu and I love
Yeah,
Amano, but for those same reasons, I'm like, well, look at Tomomomi Kobayashi or Kenji Ito or all these other composers and
yeah.
artists that Square had that were just
Oh yeah,
overshadowed.
that were being
Uh,
like underutilized and overshadowed, or they were working with like Uematsu. Like I know even Uematsu got like credited with a lot of the work for Super Mario RPG, but he was just like a consultant. He wasn't really doing a lot of that work. It was Sawamura that was doing that work, and
yeah,
it's it's I don't. I'm just very curious to see what happens in the industry now because this is like a big shakeup. This feels like
yeah.
a something that could change things
So
for the good.
the
And I
the
think your point is that there's a lot of other shit to play if you want turn based because there definitely is. And there's also like it's a good thing to have like some of the bastardization as well because some of it can breed a lot of creativity and a lot of great things within the industry because you can get that just regular generic Final Fantasy 1 with great graphics anywhere. But I think the ultimate combination is to have like basically have your cake and eat it too. Get the Final Fantasy 1 with the
yeah.
incredible graphics, but also get incredible unique gameplay mechanics that are very different while also being familiar at the same time with an incredible story with incredible characters like the thing that I hated about, and I don't know why my camera zoomed in at that moment, the thing that I hated about the newer Final Fantasies, and especially like 15, 16, what happened to having characters from this world on your party? Like everybody is just humans now in Final Fantasy. There's no more like Kamari Ronzo. There's no more even
Um,
Monaco from fucking Expedition 33. There's no more fucking Freya from Final Fantasy 9 or Vivi or whatever that fucking Amarant guy is or the Eldian girl with the horn in her head. Like
yeah.
you had all of
Aiko.
these characters from the the universe. It wasn't just humans that you were playing as. And I feel like Final Fantasy has become very like human based and all of the characters now kind of just like look the same and it's like what happened to the creativity that I want if I can make a perfect Final Fantasy to I guess or like JRPG because I don't want to give Final Fantasy the moniker of being like the king. um I would get all of those things, man. Great exposition, great story. Give me a turn-based system that's unique and inventive and utilizes some other interesting gameplay mechanics from previous games within the JRPG genre. Give me a unique, rich world with interesting characters, and let me play as some of those races and species and characters that exist within that world. Give me a struggle that I have to like overcome or whatever that's gonna bind me to these characters and this world and this story, and that's what makes a good game. And unfortunately, that's just something that we don't really get very often anymore. When it seemed like we used to get it a lot during the '90s and early 2000s. And if that's a
I,
problem with the game industry or developers or whoever you want to put the onus on, like it's just something that doesn't really happen anymore.
I think this would be a great segue to sort of one end on a shout out towards some indie games that I had mentioned coming out
Mm,
of the JRPG industry. And the first I wanted to mention is called Quester. It's a
mm,
PC game. It's available on Steam. The developer just came out with a new game this year that is in early access. Let me pull up the name. It's called Monochrome Echoes. These are sort of like overworld dungeon crawlers with really interesting turn-based mechanics, really minimal
mm.
UI and design. So for someone that like really wants this type of high quality fidelity, this game won't be it, but I still highly recommend these games. And there was a game developed by Hiroyuki Ito, who was a director of Final Fantasy 12. about a decade ago called Dungeon Encounters. It's the most strange game I have ever played, but also recommend that. And then another sort of open world sandbox 2D game called Ellen, Elin. Um, so once again, just to highlight that there are a lot of different Japanese developers doing different things. And if your viewers are like, hey, can you maybe let us know some more? I can build a list
Yeah.
easy. So as far as like my favorite game of the 2020s, one thing I forgot to mention is I had texted this to you before, but Dragon's Dogma, developed by Capcom and sort of building
Mm,
off the legacy of Breath of Fire and Monster Hunter. And I would
yeah.
put the first Dragon's Dogma alongside Dark Souls and Saga Scarlet Grace as games that I really like. But as far as like what I like for the 2020s, I already mentioned Emerald Beyond. I think without a doubt has the best battle system of contemporary JRPGs. I do want to give a shout out to Slitterhead, which it's tough whether or not to call this a JRPG. It's developed by the director who made Silent Hill. He also made a game called
Hmm.
Siren. It has Souls as combat, takes place in Kowloon, Hong Kong. Really strong art direction. Unfortunately, not the greatest polish, but I still think it's worth checking out, especially if you're someone that's like, I need more of these AA games in my
Yeah.
life that may be flawed, but they're doing interesting things. And then the last game I want to give a shout out to is Shiren the Wanderer, which is a roguelike game. And this is a whole
Mm,
sub-series that we haven't really touched upon, but you have the original Rogue being released, I think, in the early 80s. And then later on, Chunsoft takes Dragon Quest and makes a spin-off of it called Mystery Dungeon. I think a lot of people are
mm.
familiar with the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, but that in itself was already a spin-off of their mainline titles. And so Shiren 6 was released last year. It's a game I greatly enjoyed. It's really easy to pick up and play. It is quite charming. So for me, it would come down between Emerald Beyond and Shiren 6.
Okay. Yeah, I can't really speak on them. I haven't played them. Um, but I'm definitely going to try out some of the ones you recommended. Slitterhead sounds right up my alley.
Slitterhead
Um,
is so cool. I bought it for our boy who I don't want to say his name. I don't keep him private, but I bought it for our boy. I was like, listen, I own this on Steam already. I'm gonna buy the limited edition on PS5 to beg you to try it out. And he's like, all right, I will. And he played it for an hour. He goes, this shit's whack.
oh, come on.
And I was like,
To me it looks
you're
like
breaking my heart.
a Silent Hill like a kind of like a sword fighter almost. I don't know.
It's really weird, but it's so cool. And you know what? Shout out to Capcom for making Kunitsugami, Path of the Goddess, a tower
Oh, I
defense
want to play that
RPG
game.
that no one played, but for some reason they let the director, they gave him a budget for a game. And once again, just highlighting those bastard games out there that I think are quite excellent.
Yeah, there's a lot of games I want to try. Like I guess this is kind of like our closing statement. Like I stream 5 times a week. I play all different types of games. I play retro games. I play modern games. If you've stayed here for this past 4-hour podcast,
Well, you
um,
should probably split this in two episodes, right?
yeah, I might do that. I also might just do it by decade. But that's a I guess a conversation to be had.
No, I mean, it's your podcast. You can do
No, yeah,
whatever.
yeah, no, of course. Um, but yeah, man, I stream 5 days a week. Pull on up if you've watched this whole podcast and you've enjoyed what we're talking about. I play a lot of JRPGs as well. Um, all different types of genres of games, all different decades. Um, pull up to the YouTube, watch, all the content we got on there. I do anime reviews, I do video game recommendations, recaps of like my live streams, shorts, all that stuff. But hopefully you guys enjoyed. And our shout out to our special guest today, the esteemed Anthony, for pulling up and educating us on a lot of the history of JRPGs.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And if there's anything he wants to share, some socials. He's also, I don't know if he wants me to share this. But he's also if you love JRPGs, he's in the process of writing a book on the history of JRPGs.
Yeah. I don't have any socials to plug yet because I'm still completely offline, but I'm working on a few projects I'm hoping to get out there.
Yeah. So stay tuned for some of his stuff that's going to be coming out on the horizon. I know there's definitely probably going to be a lot of Expedition 33 fans that tune into this because it was a major talking point of the episode. But if you love JRPGs, then stay tuned for his book that'll be on the horizon. That'll be a way more
I
detailed
wouldn't say on
history.
the horizon, probably give it a few years,
Yeah,
but
it's
yeah,
coming. It's coming.
it's coming. It's coming.
But it'll be way more encompassing than this conversation that we had here today. But yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed, and we'll see you next time. Maybe hopefully we'll have Anthony on as a guest again in the future for another episode.